With that, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Whitworth.
Yes, ma'am. I would like to make this motion that in light of the continuing state of emergency declared by Governor Northam, where it is impractical or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location, I move that we adopt this agenda and take this action to discuss and transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue the operation of the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Second.
All those in favor, and Carol, I'll get you to call the roll.
Okay. Raymond Smoot.
Hit the space bar, Raymond.
Okay. Bert Dotson.
Yes.
Stephen Johnson.
Yes.
Mary Hines.
Yes.
Greg Yates.
Yes.
Marty Williams.
Yes.
Dixon Whitworth.
Yes.
Allison DeTunk.
Yes.
John Malvin.
Yes.
Scott Kasperwitz.
Yes.
Carlos Brown.
Yes.
Jerry Stinson.
Yes.
Shep Miller.
Yes.
Cedric Rucker.
Yes.
That completes the roll.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, everyone. We will be starting off this morning hearing from Nick Donohue. Nick, are you on the line?
I am.
There you are.
Good morning.
So we're going a little bit out of order. Nick has a meeting this morning. And so with that, the operator of our slides is a woman named Jen Renee. And so Jen's going to be changing the slides. So Jen, can we pull up Nick's presentation, please? And there it is. Thank you, Jen Renee. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Donohue.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And it's nice to see the last 6 of you that have spoken across the top of my screen here. Hopefully I'll get to see the rest of you as the presentation goes on. I'm here this morning to talk about the next phase in the VTrans development. This is something that we worked on with previous VTranses, but we want to try and take a kind of a step further as we move forward with the completion of the ongoing VTrans round. And so just a quick reminder, in January, you all adopted the vision, goals, objectives, as well as the midterm needs for the current VTrans there. And what we really want to talk about today is these midterm needs that were identified for these 4 kind of key areas that we've talked about a lot, and that, as you know, we use in SMARTSCALE to screen projects, and how we use that to really kind of move forward and start to do the project development pipeline process. So we've established what in my mind is a performance-based process and cycle here for how we develop projects, plan them, and then fund them. So, we use VTrans. We use an objective process looking at data to identify needs throughout the Commonwealth. We then use those needs to consider projects in SMARTSCALE and our other funding programs. And then with our, performance measures, which Margie's going to talk about later today, we analyze the impact of those funded projects on the performance of the system. And so we have that cycle that exists today for kind of this performance-based planning concept. But I think what we want to really try and do is look at how can we enhance the connection between VTrans and the projects that are considered on a regular basis for SMARTSCALE and some of the other funding programs. Work was started on this, and we took some initial steps back in 2017 and 2018. And so we completed the last VTrans in 2017, where we prioritized the needs. Some of you who are on the board then may recall we had Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 needs. We met with each of you individually to discuss your districts. And then for each of the Tier 1 needs, we kind of developed high-level recommendations. And the purpose of that recommendation was to really try and guide project development and start to create a new pool of projects for SMARTSCALE and other funding programs. And you all also adopted a resolution saying that when VDOT was using project development funds, for capacity expansion projects, kind of excluding state of good repair and other things of that nature, it was your intent that they would be focused in kind of on those tier 1 recommendations. And so that was, I think, a good step, and I think it started this this process of really enhancing that cycle, but we want to try and move it a bit further this time. So we'd like to kind of do the similar prioritization process for each of these needs, and again, meet with each of you all to discuss those and take a various set of data and input into account as we do that. But then instead of just developing high-level recommendations for the prioritized needs, we actually like to take it a step further and go in and develop detailed projects that can actually be submitted for future rounds of SmartScale, for revenue sharing, and for some of the other funding programs that exist out there. And importantly, as we go and develop these potential recommended solutions, we would use the guiding principles from VTrans, and you see some kind of key ones laid out there, optimize your return on investment, looking at operational improvements and other things of that nature. And the real focus kind of that concept is we want to try and make sure that we are finding tailored solutions that are cost effective to these problems. And an example I would just give out there, it's kind of a theoretical example, is there could be an area where we have a problem and you could easily, solve it with a potentially $100 million project. But if we spent more time working on it, we might be able to solve it with a $25 million project. If we're able to do that and find those types of more cost-effective solutions throughout the Commonwealth, the net effect of that is we'll be able to solve more problems on our network throughout the Commonwealth with the same amount of resources that we have available. And so that's kind of the intent of what this process and what we're hoping to do over the coming months, working with you all, local governments and regional entities to try and put that in place. And it's our goal to really have this completed by next fall, with the intent of that these projects would then be ready for local governments and regional groups to consider as they think about their round 5 applications. I know it probably seems a little early to be talking about round 5 of SmartScale when we've just started to accept applications for round 4, but believe it or not, fall of 2021 is when the local governments are going to start working on their potential applications for future rounds of SmartScale. And we would have this work be overseen by an executive work group that would be led by the Secretary's office with folks from the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, senior staff from the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. The first part of this would involve obviously prioritizing the VTrans needs. I want to stress for those listening to the meeting, this is going to involve outreach and engagement with the localities and regional entities. This is not something that we're going to lock 10 guys in a room down in the central office at VDOT and they're going to come out when the white smoke rises in a month. We are going to do some initial screen of these things using data and other analytics, but then importantly, we're going to talk to you all, the board members, but also to the local staff and the folks working at the MPOs, PDCs, and transit agencies, just as we did in the past, to try and make sure we can have that engagement. And I know, Mr. Whitworth, one of the things you and I have talked about with the last time we did this is being as clear as possible with folks up front about how this information could be used and might be used, so that as folks consider what level of engagement they want to provide, we've laid this out at the very beginning of the process. And so there's kind of clarity for those stakeholders who wish to engage as to how this information would be used. So the intermodal office folks are going to be reaching out to each of you over the next month. And I see some of you may have already been contacted to set up meetings to discuss with you kind of a draft process for how this could work. I think in general, the key kind of concepts is we're looking at the severity of the need, areas where you might have a safety and a congestion need or other types of needs overlapping. And then again, as I've stressed several times, the input from you all as board members, but then also from our local government partners. The intent of developing these applications is not to constrict what people can, or recommendations, excuse me, is not to constrict what folks can submit for SmartScale. So this would not stop a local government if they had a different idea about how a potential need could be addressed from submitting their own idea or recommendation for that. We have no monopoly on good ideas here. And so this isn't intended to limit the available options that would be out there for these local governments as they look at revenue sharing, SMARTSCALE, and our other funding programs. And the other thing that I think is a bit uncertain still at this time, and is part of what this executive work group will be analyzing over the next few months, is what are the number of resources that are available, and how many projects can we actually take from this prioritized list of needs and get to kind of a more developed project that would be ready to submit for the SMARTSCALE process. I think this is particularly important because, you know, as we've talked about previously, for a number of years, there was a dearth of funding available for these types of projects in the Commonwealth. That started to change in 2013. And over the last 3 rounds of SMARTSCALE, we've actually funded 444 projects throughout the Commonwealth. And so we want to make sure that we're refreshing the pool of available projects as we move forward into future rounds of SMARTSCALE. If we never start to develop new projects, eventually we're going to just kind of get to a place where you have whatever was left after the first 4 or 5 rounds of SMARTSCALE. And I think it's critical that we continue to develop new projects as new needs arise, but also trying to make sure we take a look at these to try and find cost-effective ways to address these needs throughout the Commonwealth. Because again, we do have limited resources, and the more needs we can address, the better. And so that's where I think the guiding principles from VTrans can be really effective for the folks out in the field who will try and develop some of these to create that kind of full cycle between SMARTSCALE, VTrans, and our performance measures. So this is my last slide, Madam Secretary. It just lays out a draft schedule. Again, we're just kind of bringing this to the board now to talk about what our intent is. We'll be meeting with each of you over the next month or two. Well, I guess we'll be Zooming or WebExing or whatever the platform might be of your preference over the next month or two. It would be our intent to come back to the board with a draft process for prioritization in either June or July, again, depending on how quickly we're able to meet with each of you. We'll then conduct that analysis and hopefully finish that by August, seek input in August and September from our local folks, which will then obviously refine the ultimate outcomes, adopt the prioritized needs later this fall, and then essentially spend about a year taking these various prioritized needs and developing into projects that will be ready to submit for our various funding programs. So with that, Madam Secretary, I'd be happy to answer any questions you or members of the board might have.
Thank you, Mr. Donohue. For those of you who have been on the board, in particular with the development of SMARTSCALE and the prioritization process, I know many of us have asked the question, how do we tie VTrans more to our programs and have it be more than just a filter to get into a program? And so this is really an attempt to make VTrans and planning far more integral into our programs and to look at solving problems through a multimodal lens. And so I've even spoken with the team about having some folks from DRPT there as we go through the process to see, what is the most effective solution. So Ms. Hines, I believe you have a question.
I do. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I'm excited that that system worked. Nick, thanks so much. This is exactly what I had been hoping for. I do have, and I'm really glad that you're going to be involving the regional entities. MBTA is spending a huge amount of money, potentially every year. My concern continues to be twofold. One is the intersection of things that jurisdictions may think are important that we may not rank as highly, and that they move forward with regional dollars, which is entirely their prerogative. But I have a concern about how all of this is going to play on the maintenance budget, and whether or not we've thought about keeping track of, just the lane miles that are going to need repaving and some of that, because the state has to do that first. And I am worried about a situation where we're back to having to spend, the largest chunk of our money on just maintaining all these enhancements to the network.
Thank you, Ms. Hines, for the those comments there. I think there's a few responses I would have. One, I think you correctly note with those regional entities, there may be instances where they choose with their regional dollars to advance projects that may or may not be on the, the VTrans need list, or even, or something that has actually scored not as well as other projects in SMARTSCALE. And again, that is ultimately their priority. I do think one thing with the increase in the number of regional entities and the amount of kind of regional dollars with the creation of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority, and now as NVTA and Hampton Road Transportation Accountability Commission kind of hit their stride, we will obviously be needing to take into account the impact of their decisions on the maintenance budget long term. I don't think anyone has any hard or fast thoughts on that. I just think you raise a fair point. That is something that we can start to look at and examine, in the coming months. I'm not sure what the right answer is, and I don't think at this time really anybody does, but I think it's a fair point that there are impacts from those decisions back to the state. I think the other thing, when we talk about the guiding principles for our needs here in VTrans, part of looking at that kind of optimizing return on investment and considering operational and TDM improvements first is that those things, ultimately should have lower maintenance costs long term and can be more cost effective ways of addressing some of those. Now, it's not going to work in every instance, so I'm not naive enough to think that every solution can be solved by some type of new operational improvement or something else of that nature. There's obviously going to be needs for roadway widenings and other large transit capital projects. But I think, if the board is focusing first on looking at, what is the most cost-effective solution, that should also help relieve some of the future burdens potentially on our maintenance system there, and let us address more of the needs that exist on the system.
Nick, that's very helpful.
Any other questions? Okay, so anyway, we have a lot to plan for. Mr. Donohue, thank you very much, and we will see you later.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
You're welcome. With that, I do want to also welcome all those who are joining the meeting today and streaming the meeting. Thank you very much for being a part of this. I did want to acknowledge that we certainly are living through unprecedented times as we were signing on today. I think we all recognize how good it is to be able to see each other through this medium, but how much better it'll be when we can all be back together. In April, well, I should say on May 14th, the April revenue report came out, and it was really the first monthly report that took into account the impact of COVID-19 on Virginia. And for those of you who may remember, it was reported that the receipts for April were down 26.2%, which is very much in line of what we anticipate to be about $1 billion revenue loss in the fourth quarter for the general fund. It's just an indication of the impact that the coronavirus is having on the Commonwealth. We certainly have a health crisis. We also have an economic crisis. Much of that loss is actually given to the fact that the governor did defer the individual and corporate income tax returns from April 15th until June 1st. And so our Secretary of Finance, Aubrey Lane, among others, are really cautioning us to make too much of a forecast at this time, because we really need to look at the collections from April, May, and June in order to really have a clearer view of where we are. And that is what we are all intending to do. I will say that from the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, revenues were down about 18.4%. Our major revenues, motor fuels tax, was down about 6.7%. The sales tax that we get within the CTF was down about 1%. The motor vehicle sales and use tax was down 40.7%. So certainly all of that is going to be impacting the program that we have. Right now, we are going to be operating using our current 6-year improvement plan in the budget that was adopted at the reconvened session. There was a budget amendment that actually allows us to maintain the 6-year improvement plan that we have in effect through June 30th of 2021, or until a new program can be adopted based on updated revenue forecasts reflecting the impact of COVID-19. Again, the reasoning behind all of this is to make sure that whatever we adopt is based on facts. So we are actually anticipating a special session on the budget in August. And then following that, there's no definitive timeline, but following that, we're anticipating having a reforecast, at which time we will be looking at the 6-year improvement plan as well. So I just wanted, I know Mr. Johnson had posed some questions. I wanted just to kind of give you a very broad, high-level overview of where we are. I think we all recognize that we're going through this very unprecedented moment, and we want to make sure the decisions we make are as clear-eyed as we possibly can. So as we go through this, we are not going to be adding any new capital programs from the state to the 6-year improvement plan. When Ms. Pryor is making her reports where she's making additions or cancellations to our program, it's really the use of federal and local dollars that she is going to be amending. But from a state perspective, we're going to be maintaining our current program until we get a reforecast. Is Mr. Lawson on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
So, Mr. Lawson, is there anything that you would add to that at this time?
No, you covered that very well. As you said, that with the delay in the air transportation revenues, it's about a 2-month lag from the time they are collected until the time we actually, or I should say, incurred before we actually collect them. So it won't be until June that we actually start to see the true impacts of the shutdown and the reduced travel and the impacts of this pandemic on air transportation revenues. And this does allow us time to be able to see what is actually happening before we take, too drastic cuts, or reactions to what we just don't know what may actually be coming.
And so while you're still here, as we are preparing for that, we have been working with all the transportation agencies, stress testing budgets, developing scenarios, trying to run the gamut of what could possibly happen to make sure that we are as prepared as possible for whatever the numbers may be. So we're going through that process right now. Mr. Donohue and Mr. Lawson have been very instrumental in working with all of the agencies. I will just give a special thanks, because I'm sure they're on the call, to Laura Farmer and Steve Pittard, who have done an outstanding job of running these scenarios with us and for us. It has been a terrific learning experience, so that as we continue to move forward through this time, we hope that we're anticipating whatever happens and just being ready for what the future may bring. So I just wanted to give an overview to that. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? Okay, with that, we will, I thank you very much for that. I thank everyone again for being a part of this today. With that, we will move into, and I believe Mr. Cary is up.
Good morning. Members of CTV, happy to be with you this morning to talk about some of the really fantastic work going on down at near the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel at Fort Wool and on barges. As you know, with the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project, there was a large nesting colony of migratory birds on the South Island that needed to move so construction could take place. So the challenge there was how to accommodate all of those birds, and really through a great partnership with DGIF, the Marine Resource Commission, Department of Historic Resources, a plan was put together to temporarily turn Fort Wool into a artificial habitat for those birds, and also turn the habitat of 1 acre of barges for those birds to use. Those barges are comprised of about 7 large barges and 2 flexi floats. Through the process of establishing that, we had to, the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries is the lead on that, and they coordinated with the Department of Historic Resources for Fort Wool. That's obviously a historic site. The Virginia Marine Resource Commission for permits for the barges, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and as well as the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, I do have to acknowledge before I get into all of this that there has been an issue in the last 12 hours or so with 2 of the barges down there. The flexi barges actually broke loose in the winds and waves and are over against the South Island. They're stable. There's a tug on scene. DGIF is on that. They're coordinating with our local staff on site and the Coast Guard to remedy that. Certainly going to be something that we will learn from, but I did want to obviously make sure that people were aware of that. Go on to the next slide, Carol. Here you see the South Island and you see Fort Wool, and Fort Wool shows all in this picture, the sand and so forth that's been placed on that. That's the desired nesting habitat to give you a good sense of what's out there. Next slide, please. Here's a little closer look at Fort Wool, and the Department of Historic Resource, or I'm sorry, the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries went in and took down trees. They secured those buildings so that birds and chicks would not go inside. They took care of any rodents and things that would have been a threat to the birds on that as they nested. And you can see created really a great habitat for them. They love the sand substrate that's been put down. Next slide. Here's a picture, and all that gray right there are birds. Several thousand birds have moved over to Fort Wool and are now nesting there. They had a decoy system they put in place. They've had a sound system that they put in place, remote control, video cameras. They're audio broadcasting 24/7 to attract the birds to Fort Wool and to the barges. They'll do that through at least late June. They've seen common terns, black skimmers. They've all responded very favorably to this habitat. They've also, both on Fort Wool and on the barges, and they, from what I understand from DGIF, they've not only are they nesting there, they're seeing courtship behaviors, which is a great thing. The birds you see on the slide there, about 2,000 royal terns. They say those have doubled in the last week. Sandwich terns have also been showing up, and they're very happy about that as well. Next slide, please. Here you see the barges being installed. They're spud barges, so those piles on the corners get driven down into the bottom, and then there are also heavy 5,000-pound concrete weights on each end to help secure those as well. So there's 7 of those types of barges, and then 2 of the flexi barges. Next slide. So as I said, Fort Wool work is complete. Over 2,000 royal terns out there nesting on the sandy habitat. Laughing gulls have been nesting in the riprap. The staff from DGIF has noted to me that there's a fantastic and new rookery of snowy egrets. Those were not previously seen in the volume they're seeing there in that area. So we've created something new and good there. Increased presence of the common terns and black skimmers. Gull-billed terns, that's the state threatened species, have been heard and seen around the island. Hope to attract the common terns and black skimmers, gull-billed terns to the barges once those decoys have all been completed. That work was going on last week and into this week. And again, the DGIF experts, they certainly believe that both on Fort Wool and the sand and on these barges is a great nesting habitat. VDOT is paying all the costs for the successful new implementation of these alternative habitats. So I just really think it's just a quick overview, but to say that it has really worked out well in terms of moving those birds from South Island over to both Fort Wool and these barges. To do that, there was Fort Wool, and the barges are really, if you want to say, that's where the candlelight and the wine and the romantic dinners are. And we attracted the birds to that. On the South Island end, we have done a lot of work there, working with Department of Game and Inland Fisheries and other experts in birds to discourage the birds from being there in very humane ways. We have installed various, like you've seen in cities where they'll have sort of spikes that stick out of building ledges so pigeons don't land there, things like that, so that the birds are encouraged not to land there, but rather to go over to Fort Wool and go to the barges. And one of the most effective things that we've had out there has been a company that has brought border collies. This is what they do. They primarily have done it in the past around airports, but these border collies are herding animals, and they very humanely really run around, and the birds are all dispatched. They perceive the border collie as a predator when in fact those border collies are not predators at all, but they perceive it that way, and the birds have moved along. So before any of the migratory birds returned this spring, they had already moved several thousand of the permanent gulls off of the South Island with those border collies and so forth. It's been very, very effective. I think we have a brief video that was prepared down in Hampton Roads District over about the dogs, and just wanted to show that at this point.
For decades, seabirds, and lots of them, occupied almost every inch of prime nesting territory at the South Island of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. But a nearly $4 billion expansion project at the HRBT necessitated efforts to coax the colonies from the island. That's where Rebecca Gibson, Zoe, Nike, and 18 other of Gibson's trained border collies come into the picture. They're part of the Flyaway Geese family, on assignment to work from sunup to sundown 7 days a week until September to keep the seabirds from nesting while work is underway on the expansion project.
Basically, the border collie works because when a border collie moves stock, they put their heads down and their tails in between their legs and they stalk things. So in the mind of the bird, the dog is a predator, but border collies don't have a kill instinct. They're herding dogs. So in their mind, they're working them just like they would sheep or cattle.
The dog's mere presence discourages the birds from landing on poles, pavement, rooftops, riprap, or anywhere they might try to settle for the season. The dogs, outfitted with protective paw wear and goggles, deter birds from landing and laying eggs here. Deterred, yes, but it appears the seabirds didn't have to fly far to find a new seasonal stopping ground. In March, Virginia's Secretary of Transportation Shannon Valentine, who oversees VDOT and its expansion project, traveled to the HRBT to observe the dogs at work and to also eye new nesting grounds for the birds at nearby historic Fort Wool, which is closed to the public. Secretary Valentine says through collaboration and cooperation between VDOT and the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, DGIF, a plan to protect the birds took flight. Fort Wool was prepped to receive thousands of the feathery flocks. Valentine says, I am grateful to Secretary of Natural Resources Matt Strickler and his team. We came together to help the migratory birds nest safely as we deliver the largest transportation project in Virginia's history. And to ensure ample nesting habitat, DGIF is also anchoring sand-covered barges between the Fort and South Island as additional space for the birds, Gibson says it's working.
It'll be a better environment for them and a better nesting habitat for them because it will be managed.
The use of herding dogs is the first phase of an approved bird management plan put in place by Hampton Roads Connector Partners, the project's contractor. HRCP hired Gibson's Stanfield, North Carolina company to work during the nesting season. Since arriving, Gibson has hired and trained 10 dog handlers to assist her and husband Josh. 6 of the 10 are wildlife biologists.
We started here, there were probably 3,000 birds on the ground when we got here in February, and maybe we see 2 to 3 try to land on a daily basis. It's very minimal. We're seeing very minimal numbers of birds. They've moved over to the Fort Wool area. We can see them from here.
Stephanie Boyles Griffith, a senior scientist with the Humane Society of the United States, says the use of herding dogs that are specially trained to flush birds without making contact is a humane and effective approach that will help keep the birds from nesting on the South Island. Boyles Griffin says, combined with long-term monitoring and responses to nesting attempts, this approach should help the seabirds make the transition to use of the alternate habitat that Fort Wool provides. Other passive bird control measures are also in place on the South Island, but so far, man's best friend appears to be key to keeping birds away from the work zone. Meanwhile, a 24-hour around-the-clock bird monitoring program will be maintained throughout the life of the construction project, which is due to end in late 2025.
I think this management plan is going to be 100% effective.
I'm Paula Miller for the Virginia Department of Transportation.
So thank you. As you can see, that the bird management plan, coupled with, I think, just an absolutely fantastic example of partnership amongst natural resources and transportation to provide for an alternative habitat while addressing the needs on our construction side as well, is just everything that the taxpayers out there should be proud of, in how things can be done cooperatively across the state and very effectively in this case. So thank you very much.
I just would like to say as well that Deputy Commissioner Cary has done an outstanding job of managing this whole process, taking care of the birds, allowing the South Island to move forward with the project. It's really been great. He's been the main liaison with Natural Resources and DJIF, and Rob, I just personally want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Madam Secretary, one question. What is our long-term strategy with the birds?
Well, you know, in the, as we are preparing, as we're continuing to work on HRBT, this is kind of the foundation for what we're doing. Natural Resources is looking at other possible things, either expanding the South Island after VDOT leaves it, or perhaps looking at expanding Fort Wool, looking at another island. All of that is actually under consideration. Our main point this year was, could we keep the project moving and take care of the birds? So this is basically step one. We will continue to work with Natural Resources and try to create a path forward. Rob, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you hit it well. The long-term plan, Natural Resources is pursuing the opportunity for other alternative habitat to see if that would be possible. But during the course of this project, the Fort Wool and the barges this first year was the test, really, to see if that would work. They felt strongly it would, and it's working, I think, better than they even envisioned it would. They're talking with their experts as recently as yesterday. They're getting calls from across the country. They've also brought in people from across the country to help, particularly with the social attraction, the calls and so forth. I know they had a professor from Oregon that had done some of that off the coast of Oregon that they consulted on how to do that effectively here. So I think that obviously we have a solution that seems to be working really well, that will get us through the course of the project as we build that. DGIF and other partners within the Secretary of Natural Resources are pursuing, is there an option for perhaps building an island or anything like that? But they don't have answers to that yet. They're just going through that evaluation process to see what might be possible. But for the course of this project, I think we're in good shape to provide a good habitat and make sure those birds are taken care of.
Thank you.
And we're also part of a study. Actually, it is, again, it's a partnership with Natural Resources. Secretary Strickler is our Chief Resiliency Officer. We have a study going on with VIMS, and looking, it's a 3-year project, but really looking at the impact of transportation on habitats. So hopefully that could help guide some decisions as well. I really want you all to meet the dogs. What I was really hoping is that we could bring the dogs to a meeting, which they've agreed to. They are amazing. They're just so gentle. So I was fascinated with the dogs and really appreciated what they're doing over there. It's just wonderful. So I hope someday for you to meet some of the dogs and the trainers. And Rob, I understand that last night we may have had a barge get loose and that the Coast Guard's working on that now.
That's correct. The 2 of the flexi barges, the smaller barges, did come loose in the high winds and wave action as a result of the tropical depression that was off the coast. But they're stable. They're against the riprap between Fort Wool and the South Island. And the Coast Guard was notified. There was a spotter on scene that's required as part of this project anytime winds reach a certain condition. They immediately notified the Coast Guard per the protocols. There's a tugboat on scene. DGIF, and leading that effort, is coordinating getting the barges back in place. But they are coordinating as well with our team at the HRBT project to make sure that everything flows flawlessly there. Obviously it's an opportunity. We're going to learn from that and make sure that does not happen again. And I would also add to that going back to the dogs, I think it's important to note these are a very common practice at airports. If you remember the Captain Sullenberger incident up in New York where birds flew into an engine, airports and birds do not mix. So that's really the bread and butter of this company that's doing this. It's a little unique spot that they're on with this island. I know that Rebecca, who is on the video, talked about she always wanted to be on waterfront property. She didn't expect it to be on an island like that. But I will say in closing that they are PETA approved. I think that's important to say something about that this is a very humane way to deal with the birds. The birds just fly away and the dogs kind of run around like they're chasing a tennis ball. They're having a great time and the birds are never harmed in any way. And the birds have obviously taken their lead from the dogs and moved over to Fort Wool en masse.
So thank you, Rob. Okay, and with that, we will now move to Susan Shaw, I-66.
Good morning, Madam Secretary and members of the board. Good to be here. I am going to update you broadly on the concession fee projects that are being done with monies from the I-66 outside the Beltway P3 project. And on the next slide, you'll see just a summary of some of the prior actions and how we've arrived at the point that we're at today. Back in November of 2017, we had financial close for the project and we received a concession fee payment from the private developer of roughly $579 million. Of that, $500 million was set aside in an agreement with VDOT and NVTA that was done in June of 2017. That's the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, who had a call for projects, and then they selected projects for the Commonwealth Transportation Board to consider for approval. That was done back in July of 2017. And then in January 2018, the Commonwealth Transportation Board approved the initial projects and budgets that were making use of that $500 million. There have been a few budget adjustments that have been somewhat, I would call, minor in nature, moving monies among those projects, but still with the main projects that had been selected. There were some that were done back in September 2019 by the NVTA and then approved by the CTB. There's also one small adjustment that's happening later today as part of your 6-year plan, some transfer adjustments as well. As of April 2020, expenditures out of the $500 million are approximately $33 million. I would just note there is a lag because a lot of these projects are being done by entities outside of VDOT, either DRPT or localities. And so that doesn't reflect the progress, it just reflects what has actually been used out of that $500 million fund. And so on the next slide, I just wanted to quickly walk you through the projects that have been approved and are underway. You can see there's a variety of entities that are doing the projects, as well as a variety of types of projects. The first 4 on the list are projects that are actually being done by the design builder for the 66 outside the Beltway project, because those projects were integral to the work that they were already doing as part of the broader Transform 66 project. 3 of those, which include bridge widenings, as well as work at the 66 around the Route 29 interchange in Centerville. All of those are under construction. And then the pedestrian widening at the Monument Drive Bridge is still under design, and we have yet to finalize a final price, but we are still continuing to work with the contractor on that. There are a number of transit improvements in the corridor. Fairfax County is working on a parking garage very close by to Monument Drive. There at Fairfax Corner, they have a design concept that they've developed, and they're getting their zoning in place. At the same time, they are beginning to work towards design build procurement for that project. The East Falls Church bus bay expansion is planned to start next spring. It's been somewhat put on hold because they're using that area for the metro station platform work that's going to get started this weekend on the Orange Line. So they're waiting until that area is freed up for them to get that bus bay expansion done. And then there's a Western bus maintenance and storage facility that PRTC is doing. That is well underway, and about 67% of that funding has actually been reimbursed by DRPT. And there are 3 smaller pedestrian improvement projects. VDOT is actually doing one of those, but the first one, Nutley Street, is a small improvement by the town of Vienna. They have design underway. The George Snyder Trail is a parallel trail on the south side of 66 that will connect into some of the trail network that's being accomplished as part of the overall 66 project. And the town, or city of Fairfax, is doing that project with design underway. And then VDOT's doing a small sidewalk, a missing link that's along 29, also parallel to the 66 corridor. And then there are 4 roadway projects that were approved as part of the overall group of projects. Route 50 in Waples Mill is a intersection improvement just off of the corridor, but feeding into access onto 66. That's being done by VDOT with design underway. And then Prince William County has 2 roadway projects. One is the Balls Ford widening project, and there they have design underway. They're planning to have that as a design bid build project. And then the project we're focused on today for a funding adjustment for your consideration is the one at Route 234 and Ballsford Road interchange. And there is a design build contract that Prince William County has just awarded, and they would like to make a change as a result of their the bids that they received on that project. And then Route 29 is a widening project that VDOT is has underway. Design is underway. Construction is anticipated in 2023. And so with the next slide, we can talk about the project that will come up as an action item for you later today. And that is the interchange project at Route 234 at Ballsford Road. This is a project that was approved originally with a concession fee of $145 million. The county initiated design and design build procurement back in the fall of 2018. But as a result of their award that they have just done, the total project cost is now revised to $103.5 million with that bid. And when they kind of took a step back to look at other projects in the region and the roadway network, Prince William County has requested through NVTA to approve extending their project limits by about a little over a half of mile to Devlin Road, and that will tie it in at the intersection with University Boulevard. There's a revenue sharing project at that intersection to widen out the approaches, and with that and this extension, you would now have a continuous 4-lane section all the way down to University Boulevard. And so, you know, by extending that, they'll have a better able to serve economic activity in the corridor and provide that continuous 4-lane section. Earlier or late last week on May 14th, NVTA did consider this request and recommended approval for adjusting the concession fee amount, as you'll see on the next slides. So the next slide, and this is a 2-part slide. So I've got half of the projects on one slide and half on the next, but you'll see there the proposed adjustment. And so the adjustment that has been requested by Prince William County and approved by NVTA is to reduce the overall concession fee amount from $145 million to $130 million, resulting in a savings of $15 million. And that new estimate includes that extension of 0.57 miles that we just talked about. And then you can see on the following slide what the resulting amount would be, leaving approximately $18 million in funds available that could be allocated to other projects. And so on the last slide, just a reminder of how projects get identified and what happens based on the agreement and also on the Code of Virginia. They do have to benefit the toll facility user, and that's a Virginia code requirement. They do have to be federally eligible, meaning they fit a category of the type of project that could be selected. However, they don't have to necessarily meet federal requirements as a project unless the project is commingled with, has funding, the concession fee funding commingled with federal funding. And then they do have to meet one of the project improvement goals that was part of the agreement. You can see those listed there. And the process is that they get selected and recommended by the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and then come to the Commonwealth Transportation Board for approval. And so with that, I could take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Susan. Mr. Malbin, I thought you would really enjoy this presentation. Any questions? Mr. Kasowitz, Ms. Hines, anything you'd like to say?
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I would just say that I think this makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I was fully briefed by staff and by Prince William. So I would really recommend this to my colleagues. Otherwise, we're going to have this little hourglass situation. This location feeds into the VRE station and more parking that's being added. And so really will help people in that region decide to take VRE rather than drive on 66. It's a good project.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. Mr. Kaspwitz, anything?
Yeah, yes, Madam Secretary, I agree with Mary's comments. It's nice to have a bid come in below the estimate as well. I think this is a good solution all around.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
I hope everyone's well today. My question's more generic. I know we took a $500 million concession fee about 3 years ago. What kind of interest or other kind of additions would go towards that 500 million over that 3 years, since we're not spending it all at one time? And where does that money go? Does that go back into that budget, or does it go somewhere else?
Susan, I know this question had come up earlier. I can't, was it,
I mean, I can,
yes.
I think I can answer, but I think, Laura Farmer also may want to step in. But the agreement within VTA caps the amount of money that the department could make available to NVTA for selection of projects at 500 million. The remaining monies were dedicated towards the project oversight and risk, management for the project. Our estimate it has been set at $100 million. So you can see that there was a gap there that we started with.
Laura Farmer, are you on the call?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Through April of this year, the concession funds from I-66 outside the Beltway have earned about $25 million in interest. We anticipate another deposit by year end, but that's what's been earned to date, and it's isolated to that fund in the same way that initial deposit was reflected with the Commonwealth.
Thank you. Wow, y'all just popped up on my screen. I have a different view of all of you. So thank you. Any other questions? Okay, Susan, thank you. That was great. And we'll look forward to the vote later today. Before we move on to Marcie Parker and the Rappahannock River crossing, I did just want to say about our last bird presentation, I just wanted to recognize Bill Leidy, who has been so helpful throughout this whole process and working with the birding community. And anyway, just a shout out to him for all of his help. With that, Marcie Parker.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Secretary and members of the board. Today, I'm here to brief you all on the 95 northbound Rappahannock River Crossing project, and later today, you'll be considering this project for award. Next slide, please. The project background. So the project is a sister project to the southbound Rappahannock River project that is currently under construction between exits 133 and 130 on I-95. The northbound project will create through lanes and local lanes, just like the southbound project, between exits 133 and 130. It will connect to the recently completed safety improvement project at exit 130, and it will also have direct connections into the Express Lanes Extension project, which is currently under construction. The project does have a budget of $132 million. There was a design public hearing held in August of 2019 with broad public support. On the next slide, it shows the typical section. So similar to the southbound project, this project creates 3 additional lanes in order to separate the through traffic from the local traffic. There are a couple of differences between the projects. Unlike the southbound project, which began north of exit 133 and will end south of exit 130, this project will begin at exit 130 with those recently completed interchange improvements, and it will extend north of the 133 interchange. The difference is based on the traffic volumes at peak periods. Another difference in this project versus the southbound is that southbound is not making any changes to traffic patterns at the interchange ramps, with the exception of the collector distributor lanes. This project, however, will be eliminating a loop ramp at exit 133 and will be changing the traffic flow for all Route 17 traffic to exit on the same ramp instead of two different ramps. On the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about bid options. So because of the complexity of this project, that it was a bit more than the southbound project due to some environmental requirements as well as traffic volumes, the budget was very tight during development. So we had bid 3 options on the project. The first option is on the northern end of the project. It is to extend the auxiliary lane from the CD lane all the way up to the next exit ramp at exit 136. This came out of the FAMPO I-95 corridor study, which showed this area would fail in the design year of 2042. The second option is to replace the existing northbound collector distributor lane bridge over Route 17. If you look at the top picture, the bridge I'm talking about is on the left. The 2 existing mainline bridges at this interchange are being replaced under the southbound project. The northbound bridge is under construction in the photo, and the southbound bridge is the one all the way on the right-hand side that kind of looks like a patchwork quilt. The new bridge between them is the new mainline bridge for the southbound project. With the replacement of the 2 existing bridges, that bridge on the left, which is the old bridge, will be the oldest bridge in the interchange, and it does not currently meet federal vertical clearance requirements. The other 2 bridges under construction also did not meet these requirements, but they will once they're rebuilt. This would leave this CD bridge as the lowest and the most vulnerable during strikes from large trucks. Large truck strikes have been very common in this interchange for many years, and when a truck strikes the bridge, it typically takes hours for the interchange to reopen to traffic due to the inspections that must occur for the safety of the traveling public. The third option is to install sidewalk on Route 17 through the interchange. This was a request from Stafford County. As you can see from the bottom picture, there is currently no room for pedestrian accommodations under the existing bridges. Once all 4 bridges in the interchange are finished, there will be available space for pedestrian accommodations. This will connect an area east of the interchange with many homes to the shopping and restaurants on the west side of the interchange. And I'm happy to say that the bid prices came in such that we were able to afford all 3 bid items within the $132 million project. The next slide goes over the schedule. So you can see right now we're at May of 2020, and that is when hopefully you will be awarding the project later today. The construction is anticipated to begin in the fall, and the project has a May 17th, 2024 completion date. There is also an interim milestone for certain work on the northern end of the project to be completed by October 29th of 2021, and this is to avoid conflicts with the adjacent express lanes project. That interim milestone is incentivized at $14,000 a day for about up to 45 days, which would be a $630,000 maximum incentive. So on the next slide, the action items that I'm requesting is for you to award the project later today, as well as to approve some limited access changes that Ms. Susan Keene will present a little bit later today regarding the project. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the project.
Thank you, Marcie. Mr. Rucker, anything you'd like to add?
I think Marcie has laid it out really well. This is a part of a well-integrated plan to create safety, to take away some hazards, and to allow our 95 endeavors to meet the needs of not just the region, but the entire corridor for the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Mr. Rucker. Any other questions?
Is this a SMARTSCALE project?
No, sir, this is not a SMARTSCALE project. This project is funded through a variety of funds, mix of STP, Priority Transportation Funds, bonds proceeds, and also $45 million from Transurban.
Okay, thank you.
Marcie, that question always comes up.
Yes, it does.
Yes. Anyway, thank you, Marcie. Thank you very much. And with that, we have Jen DeBruhl.
Good morning, Madam Secretary and members of the board.
Good morning.
Good morning. I have a brief presentation for you today on some transit updates to the fiscal year 26-year improvement program. Jen Renee, if we can go to the next slide, please. So as the Secretary mentioned already this morning, there's a budget language that allows the CTB to extend our current 6-year improvement program into fiscal year 21. For our transit agencies, this creates a little bit of a challenge because we typically allocate our assistance to those transit agencies on a year-to-year basis. So the presentation I'm giving today is going to summarize the modifications that are necessary to carry funding forward for critical activities through just the first quarter of fiscal 21, and for us to allocate federal formula funds that come to DRPT to the transit agencies. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with the state transit operating assistance. Our transit agencies over the past couple of months have faced really unprecedented conditions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. They've been out there maintaining essential lifeline services for their communities, and their transit operators have really been on the front lines dealing with the pandemic. So it's been a real challenging time in our industry. The operating assistance that we provide through the state formula does offset just a portion of their operating expenses. It's 20 to 30%, and it varies by agency. So it's a small portion of their operating expense in a typical year. Even with the funding that came to us from the Federal CARES Act, there is a significant amount of uncertainty in transit agency budgets. Many of them are adopting their fiscal year 21 budgets right now and are really having to look at some challenging times ahead, just like we are. So our recommendation is that we go ahead and allocate funding that's equivalent to 1/4 of last year's operating assistance to the transit agencies to carry them through the first quarter of fiscal 21, and then reevaluate where we are in terms of the Federal CARES Act and other funding that's available in September. Next slide, please. We do have a couple of other unique operating assistance elements of the program. These are things that we don't highlight a lot in our presentations, but they are very important. We have 2 agencies that receive some special assistance to provide commuter services in the I-95 corridor. This is the Potomac-Rappahannock Transportation Commission, or OmniRide, and Fairfax County with the Fairfax Connector. We are recommending that we continue the same funding level as fiscal year 20 and allocate 1/4 of that amount to carry those agencies through the first quarter of fiscal 21. They have been operating service, but at a much lower level over the past couple of months. This gives us a little bit more time to work with them to reevaluate that funding over the summer and see what their needs are going to be and how those services rebound over the next few months. Jen Renee, next slide, please. We also work with a number of commuter assistance programs around the state. These agencies are typically primarily working on things like carpooling and vanpooling, but they also support telework. Since March, we've been working closely with those agencies to rescope their efforts since we've been in this more of a demand for our telework support. And so we're working with those agencies to help businesses in their communities to support telework. And we've also started talking to them about how do we prepare for a return to work and commuting later this year. These agencies do an annual budget for us. It's very detailed. So we've been able to work through those individual agency budgets, evaluate them, and pull out anything that is discretionary or not critical to keep those agencies and those programs up and running at a minimum level. So we've established some baseline budgets for them. So we're recommending a lower level of funding for them than fiscal 20, and the allocation of the first quarter of that so that we could continue those programs through the summer, and that we would reevaluate that in September as well. Next slide, please. As the Secretary mentioned this morning, capital is just not something we're thinking about right now. We're really focused on our core services and our core operations. We do have one capital item that is critical. It has to do with debt service that PRTC carries on behalf of the Virginia Railway Express for a parking facility in Manassas Park. This particular item, it's relatively small, does need to be funded at the beginning of fiscal year 21 to allow PRTC to continue to make those debt service payments. So we are recommending that the state portion of that be added to the 6-year program. In terms of capital, back in March, I did brief you on our capital applications and that we had received by our February 1st deadline. We're going back through all of those capital requests now to determine if there are any critical needs that without those particular items being funded that would impact the provision of service through fiscal year 21. We're doing some scenario planning. We're going to continue working on that through the summer and reevaluate that again in September. And finally, I want to summarize our federal programs. We do allocate several categories of federal funding assistance in our 6-year program. These particular programs are our metropolitan planning. This is money that flows to the metropolitan planning organizations through DRPT. That funding, there's some funding that comes to FTA for statewide planning that stays with DRPT. We also have our small urban transit. This is funding that comes to the DRPT and we allocate by a federal formula, but then those agencies then apply directly to FTA for that funding. So we would want to go ahead and move forward with the allocation of that. And then finally, we do receive funding for human service transportation programs. These are our programs that help senior citizens and those individuals living with disabilities. We're recommending the allocation of a portion of that funding now, again, supporting those operating needs and operating costs, and also the mobility management. These are the program support folks that help these communities access their transportation needs. We're recommending going ahead and allocating that portion of the 5310 for human service program. We are recommending that we hold off on the capital funding requests this time. Those capital funding requests were made very early this year prior to COVID-19. So we want to go back and determine if there's still local matching funds available to support those capital items. We'll reevaluate that like everything else in September. That wraps up my presentation. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Madam Secretary, could I just ask one question? This is Mary. I guess I'll go ahead. Jen, is it fair to say that in terms of capital spending through the merit program, that the most important criteria you're using is, do you need to move forward on the capital project in order to deliver service in 21? That other issues beyond that are not ones that you're currently considering?
Ms. Hines, yes, we're doing some scenario planning right now, and in terms of critical, we're looking at only those items that without that particular item, transit service would be impaired or unable to operate in fiscal year 21. So it's a very, very high bar for critical. Things like, capital projects that have a longer lifespan, demonstration technical assistance programs are certainly a much lower priority. We're really looking at just those things that are critical to keep service going at the levels that are in place today.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Director Mitchell, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, not at this point. I think Jen summed it up very well.
Jen DeBruhl, thank you so much. Excellent job. With that, we'll have Kim Pryor.
Good morning, Madam Secretary, members of the board. I'm here to brief you this morning on a proposed SMARTSCALE project cancellation in Bristol District for the Route 460 Corridor Improvement Project. Next slide, please. By way of background, the SMARTSCALE policy states that a project that's been selected for funding through one of the SMARTSCALE programs can only be canceled by an action of the board. It goes on to state that in the event that a project is not advanced to the next phase when requested by the board, the locality or the regional entity may be required to repay any funds expended on the project. Next slide, please. The Route 460 Corridor Improvement Project was submitted by Tazewell County in round 3 of SMARTSCALE. Has a total project cost of about $3.6 million. It was completely funded with SMARTSCALE funds from the district grant program. The project received a score of 10.5 and was the highest ranked project in the district in round 3. The project is VDOT administered. It has not yet advanced to scoping. The original scope of the project included some operational and geometric improvements at several intersections. It also included some entrance closures or modifications at 6 locations. Next slide, please. This is just a graphic that shows the location of the project at 460 and US 19 in Tazewell County. Next slide. After the project was selected for funding, the county and the public raised some concerns that the project would adversely impact businesses and make the corridor less safe. VDOT district staff identified numerous scope refinements and alternative designs, none of which were supported by the public or the county. And on March 3rd, the Tazewell County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to withdraw their application for SMARTSCALE funds. Next slide. So the department's recommendation to the board is to cancel this SMARTSCALE project and transfer all of the $3.6 million in construction district grant funds back to the Bristol district deallocation balance entry. This will be presented to you for action next month. I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Question. This is Shep. Was this just a, was there a political change that sort of generated this cancellation? I mean, obviously the board voted on it. They should have had conversation with the people along the way. We then went through the whole process and allocated funds to it, and then they didn't like it. So what can you help me understand what happened?
Sure. Yes, sir. My understanding is that there was some change in leadership in the county, and the access management and operational improvements were not supported anymore.
Mr. Miller, this is Jerry Stinson. I would just echo what Ms. Pryor said, and that's Mr. Necessary, the district admin, and has kept me in the loop, and then there has been enough political change that it was no longer supported, and the district did offer quite a lot of alternatives to try to keep the project going, but they just absolutely lost interest.
Thank you, Mr. Stinson. Anybody else? Okay, thank you, Ms. Pryor. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is it Mr. Whitworth?
Yeah, this Madam Secretary, Mr. Dodson.
Mr. Dodson.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I put my hand up. What I'm trying to say, Jerry or Kim, is that where the airport is right there? You go up the road right in that intersection from where the Walmart is at, Jerry?
Yes, sir. If at that intersection, the closest business is a Lowe's. The intersection also goes toward Richlands and toward Buchanan County, but it's about almost a mile before the turnoff to the airport.
Yeah, that's where the road splits up, going further west and go a little southwest.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
So, I mean, that's a lot of money that was been deferred by a county that's not real popular. It's just, everybody just didn't like the project, $3.5 million to make it more safely conscious, I guess, and more accessible.
The best explanation would be the political climate changed sufficiently that that it was no longer supported. I can't say about the majority of the people, but the political climate was changed sufficiently that it was stopped.
You mean it's just a change of board of supervisors? I mean, it's not. I mean, I think it's only one political party's got pretty much the numbers in Tazewell County. I guess it's just individuals that got on the board that were against the project.
Yes, sir. I think that would be accurate.
Okay, thank you, Jerry.
Mr. Rucker.
We avoid this sort of situation here. I'm sure that issues of safety were factored in, all the traditional elements that go into the evaluation of these endeavors were played out. And in the midst of that, I'm sure a cross-section of voices from the community, as Bert has just pointed out, were also heard. How do we avoid finding ourselves in this situation, which is not really good?
I don't know if anybody can actually give you a firm answer on that, but we live in a world where there are changes. There's changes of administrations. There are changes of priorities. This is not a unique situation, but I do believe that the district engineer, Donnie Necessary, and the team down there have really tried to do a good job of managing this to the best of their ability. And this was the decision.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Mr. Stinson.
I would again emphasize that it was a change in philosophy and in belief in folks who took some seats on I would give Mr. Necessary and his team all the credit in the world for trying to mitigate everything, but in the end, this was the county's decision, and it's just I think as a board that we're going to encounter things like this probably in the future. This is just this kind of maybe the first bump in the road that we're going to encounter on projects like this, and it's nothing more than some folks having a different opinion as it regards to what the project would do to serve safety and other concerns.
And I will just say that those of us who served on this board, recognizing that sometimes it's not just political or a change in leadership, but sometimes we learn things. Sometimes we learn we can do them better. Sometimes there are many factors that go into a project not moving forward. Sometimes it's the cost, where the estimates just don't match the bid prices. There are a lot of factors that could lead us to this kind of situation or decision. I think it doesn't happen as often as some people actually anticipated that it would. I think what's really important is that we're always listening. We're always trying to be flexible, to make sure we're making decisions with the best information we can. And that's really what the team did down there. So I just, it's making the right or best decisions or the smartest decisions with the information we have. And these situations are inevitably going to be a part of our world. Commissioner Britch, I just don't know if there's anything you'd like to add.
Madam Secretary, nothing at this time. I think you've mentioned it or stated very well that we will experience change in priorities for particular projects. I think SMARTSCALE overall has done a very good job in trying to make sure that we have the community agreement prior to coming before the board to be able to have the project scored and accepted and funded. But priorities do change over the course of a project, and this unfortunately is one of the first ones that we have. I think of all things, the Bristol district has done an excellent job in one, identifying potential projects, and two, having the community support and backing before it comes in as a smart scale application. But again, priorities have shifted and changed, and this is just one of those that we'll experience moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Tonk?
Thank you. Ms. Pryor, you noted in the presentation that this project scored the highest in the district. What drove that high score?
It was primarily the access management improvements that generated a high safety score, safety benefit. Plus, it's a relatively low-cost project, so the two combined gave it a high score.
I always hate to hear about safety projects being canceled. Another question I had was in regard to any sunk cost to move the project forward. Are those costs borne by VDOT at this point?
The project actually has no expenditures at this point, and so that would not be an issue for this particular project.
Thank you.
Good question, though. Thank you.
Madam Secretary?
Mr. Whitworth.
Ms. Pryor, just in as much as this is kind of one of the first like this, and for everybody's edification, this $3.5 million now that goes back to their district grant deallocation balance. It's my understanding that that balance can be used to cover shortfalls that may occur in other smart scale projects that are going forward. The question is, can that deallocation balance be utilized for any new project?
Mr. Whitworth, that's a great question. Typically, we hold those deallocation balances to address cost increases. It is up to the CTB member at the time when we start selecting projects, if you want to utilize some of those balances to supplement funding for the next round. Most of you have opted to hold on to those balances as long as they stay at a relatively small amount to cover potential cost increases.
But that would take place at the next round of smart scale, is that right?
Yes, sir, it would.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitworth. Thank you, Ms. Pryor.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary?
Mr. Dodson.
Yeah, one last thing. I would say, Jerry, you did a good job in describing the situation. I mean, $3.5 million is not a very big project, but you got a bunch of counties, a bunch of small towns, and I know that for sure that part of Southwest Virginia, that's the economic hub as far as retail at Claypool. And it's real disappointing. I wasn't part of the process of smart scale awards in the past, but I've been through that section a few times, and that is a congested section. So it's unfortunate. And being top scorer in your whole district, the whole district of Bristol district is pretty unfathomable that the board of supervisors would unanimously turn it down. So hope they don't have any other projects in Tazewell. So that's all I got to say. It was a real disappointment. But you did a good job presenting, the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dawson.
Okay, thank you. And now we'll go on to Joanne Maxwell, Periodic Regulatory Review.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. I am here to present to you what is now the third round of the Periodic Regulatory Review. Jen, next slide, please. As you will recall, the first several slides on this presentation are the same that you've seen previously. The point of slide 2 is simply that this is required by the Administrative Process Act. And the periodic review is intended not to necessarily dig into the substance of the regulations for purposes of policy changes, et cetera, but rather it's intended to make sure the regs are still current, they're still supported by statute, whether they're still necessary for the protection of public health, safety, and welfare, whether they're still clearly written, et cetera, and the length of time, frankly, since the regulation has last been evaluated. Jen, next slide, please. There are basically two authorities or two sources of mandates that dictate this review. One is Governor's Executive Order 14, which specifies the process for conducting the review and then requires that the review be performed on all regulations at least once every 4 years. And then Chapter 444 of the 2018 Acts of Assembly requires the Department of Planning and Budget to report to the General Assembly those entities or agencies that are actually complying with the requirements of that are set forth regarding regulatory reviews. And I would note that what we are doing in this process is, rather than taking the whole complement of regulations and reviewing them in one fell swoop, which would be quite an endeavor, we are taking portions or certain chapters at, 5 or 6 chapters at a time, so that we can just keep this on sort of a rotating basis. So that being said, next slide, Jen. As far as the process goes, what we're required to do is post the notice to Town Hall that we're beginning a periodic review. That notice is then published in the Virginia Register of Regulations. The agency, VDOT, then collects the any public comments that are presented or provided in response to the regulations. And then within 120 days of the end of the public comment period, the agency has to report on its review, the agency or the CTB, indicating one of the following, and that is that the regulation can be retained as is, that it needs to be amended, or that it can be repealed. In this particular case, we posted the notice of comment or for public review or for public comment, and that was done on March 30, and then the public comment period closed on April 20. So technically now we have 120 days from April 20 to complete these reviews on this next set. Next slide, Jen. As noted previously, we have basically 38 chapters to be reviewed over the next 3 or 4 years. We've already gone through about 14 chapters, and we now are looking at 3 more. Earlier, I would say it was probably in March, I sent to all members the 6 regulations or chapters that we were going to be reviewing. Subsequent reviews have demonstrated, and research has demonstrated that actually only 3 of the regulations that I sent to the board members are board regulations. The other 3 really fall under the purview of VDOT, and I will address that shortly on the next slide. But basically, the process that we're using is we are doing 1 workshop presentation on the regulations that are under review, and then in the following month or 2 months, we are asking the board to take action on the recommendations that we're offering as to the status of the regs. Next slide, Jen. So this slide is demonstrating or showing, after we look a little more deeply into the code and statutes, we realized that only 3 of the regulations that I provided you earlier this quarter fall under CTB purview. Those are the land use permit regulations, the procedures for inclusion of routes in the non-interstate qualifying network and the Virginia access systems, and then the rules and regulations and rates concerning toll and bridge facilities. 3 of the regulations that I sent you actually do not fall under the purview of the CTB. The first set, solicitation use of VDOT buildings and grounds for non-work purposes, are actually, there is no statutory authority for these regs whatsoever. And frankly, these regs are regs that would typically be considered, or the issues addressed by these regs are typically something that an agency head or an agency would address. Same thing is true for access management regs. The per code section 33.2245, the commissioner or VDOT is directed to promulgate regs addressing access management. And then finally, the comprehensive roadside management program, same thing. The statute section 33.2265 provides that the department, VDOT, shall promulgate those regulations to address that program. So that's why at this point, we are only going to be asking the CTB to look at the first 3 regs on the slide because the statutes and the law dictate otherwise for the other regs. Next slide, Jen. The first set of regs is a rather sizable group of regs. It's the land use permit regulations. Under the Code of Virginia in section 33.2-210, the Commonwealth Transportation Board has general authority to make regulations for the protection of and covering traffic on and for the use of systems of state highways. Basically, this body of regulations addresses, it's responsible for setting forth the requirements for issuing permits, for obtaining permits, for work activities that are going to be conducted on the right-of-way, for instance, work activities relating to construction, utility installations, entrances, events, other types of activities. To summarize, basically, per the land use permit regulations, basically it says a land use permit covers the actual performance of work within highway rights-of-way and the subsequent maintenance, adjustments, or removal of the work. So the regulations themselves don't necessarily get into the merits of the particular work, but rather they just talk about when it's time for this work to be done. Here's how it should be done. And the regs address things like safety issues, things like if you've got to close travel lanes, here's how it has to be done. If you're going to affix signs in the right of way, these are the requirements. Sets forth the fees, for instance. Lost my slide there. It sets forth fees. Jen, could you go back to slide 7? Thank you. It sets forth the fees and things like surety requirements, et cetera. Again, it's designed, these regulations are designed to address how the work is actually done, ensuring safety and making sure traffic is not necessarily impacted to a great extent. These regulations were originally adopted by the CTB in 2010. They were last amended in 2018 to allow mobile food vending and to change certain wireless structure use fees. Both those changes were dictated by changes in the law. These regulations clearly are necessary for the protection of the public. They're written to be understandable, and they're very critical for performance of work in the right of way. It's how we make sure that work that is being done is done in accord with certain procedures and safety measures, et cetera. When we posted these, no public comments were received. As a result, we are recommending that the regulations, this set of regulations, be retained as is. Jen, next slide, please. The next slide, I'm going to go to the punchline first. This set of regulations, these are the regulations for inclusion of routes in the non-interstate qualifying network and the Virginia access systems. We are basically recommending that these regulations be repealed. Not to say there's an underlying process that basically is merely referenced in the regulations, and that is the extent of the regulation. And the process that is mentioned is the process for bringing a road into one of the non-interstate qualifying network. Let me give you a little bit of background. Back in 1982, federal law was enacted. It was titled the Surface Transportation Assistance Act. The purpose of that act was to allow vehicles, over-dimensional vehicles, to basically provide them the ability to operate on, not just on interstates, but on roadways off interstates, recognizing the fact that even though they might have been authorized to operate on interstates, there was still a need for these vehicles to be able to get on and off the interstate to get to their points of destination, et cetera. So the act basically allowed states to designate the additional networks of highways for those particular over-dimensional vehicles. The CTB is given statutory authority to designate routes on the NIQN and VAS pursuant to 1112. Again, though, this regulation, all it does is reference a procedure that is maintained by our traffic engineering division in VDOT. And the procedure, it dictates how a road, what's taken into consideration when a road is deemed or taken, is asked to be or requested to be taken into the NIQN or VAS. As a result, we don't believe that these procedures need to be in the form of a regulation. They can be, you know, they are, again, currently in place, and they could as easily be retained as a guidance document or an internal policy directive or a document. The procedures themselves were approved. FHWA actually approves the procedures. They were approved by the FHWA in 1991. The regulation itself was adopted in 1993. It's not been amended. No public comments have been received. The last time this board took an action to accept a road into the NIQN, I believe was in 2012, and it was associated with the South Norfolk Jordan Bridge. So again, it's the procedure itself that is the substance of this regulation, and there's just, we don't see any reason why this procedure would need to be set out as a reg, and as a result, we're recommending that the regulation be repealed, not the procedure, but just the regulation. Next slide, Jen. The last set of regs deal with rules, regulations, and rates concerning toll and bridge facilities. And this particular regulation specifies today, in its current form, the rates for use of non-P3 VDOT-owned toll facilities. That is basically 3 facilities. It is the Coleman Bridge, the Poe White Parkway Extension, and the Dulles Toll Road. The regulation talks about the toll rates. It also talks about the authority and procedures to be used when it's necessary to suspend tolls for specific situations such as natural disasters, emergencies. And then after reviewing these, we found a couple of issues with these regulations, that they basically are out of date. VDOT has added several additional facilities to VDOT maintain toll roads. We believe the regs are likely going to need to be updated for those, to add those facilities. There are also some means, basically the individuals and the entities, the process that's set out in the regulation for suspension of tolls in certain situations are clearly outdated. For instance, they mention certain entities have the authority to take certain actions. Those entities are entities in VDOT that no longer exist, certain positions, et cetera. So it really needs, the regulation needs to be updated and brought into a more current state. So as a result, when we posted these regulations, we received no public comments. But based on the foregoing, what we are doing is recommending that the regulations be amended to make them more current with reality as well as the law. Jen, next slide. So that is in a nutshell what we're asking. We're asking the CTB to, we will be coming back in June with a resolution asking you all to address the 3 regulations I just went through, the land use permit regulations, the NIQN, and the toll regulations. We'll be asking you to approve the actions that we've recommended today. And then once you all have done that, if assuming that CTB is in agreement with those actions, we will post the results on Town Hall. And then next fall, we'll go through and we will do another set of regulations, 5 or 6 or so, and we'll go through the same process. And then, you know, at this point, this is a continuum. It is, again, we are required by law to review these every 4 years. We may actually get a little bit of a break once we get through the next 3 rounds. After this round, I think it looks like we might be able to take a year or 2 break if we so choose. Madam Chair, that is my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Maxwell. Very thorough as usual. Ms. Hines, anything that you would like to add to the discussion?
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I did spend some time with Ms. Maxwell on this set of regs, reading through them and sending comments. And I pretty much concur with the recommendations that they're making. I think they're wise. The one that we spent the most time on was the land use permitting one. It is the place where where I think people become aware of VDOT's control of the right of way. And we do allow for utilities and others to get a blanket permit to do a variety of work. Sometimes that's an issue for neighborhoods, and I'm not suggesting that we should change this regulation at all, but it may be some point down the road something that the board wants to look at as environmental issues, I think, move more and more to the fore in some of the installations. We may want to maybe have a clearer appeal process or a little bit more transparency, I think might be helpful, but I don't think it's worth spending time on now in the climate that we're in. So I just put that out there as something that I noticed that made me think maybe we need more transparency.
Times, anybody else? Okay, Ms. Maxwell, thank you.
Madam Secretary.
Mr. Miller.
This is Shep. I raised my hand, but perhaps you don't see that.
I can't see it.
The two questions really. One is, if we get rid of a regulation, but we keep it in policy or procedure that has the effect or the strength of regulation, what benefit does the Commonwealth get through that process? Why is it better to have it as a policy or procedure if we're just going to sort of downgrade it from regulation? And two, the details that you're suggesting with regard to the amendments for some of these regulations, I don't think I see the detail of the changes that you're recommending or that will recommend. And so how do I see that, or when will I see that?
Madam Chair. On the first question, the benefits, I would say, of eliminating a reg are probably twofold. One thing is, particularly when there's no need to have a regulation, and I'll use the NIQN as an example. This is merely a process that talks about if an entity is interested in having a roadway or a route, like South Norfolk or Jordan Bridge did several years ago, if they're interested in having a route added to the system, there's a process, they make a request, and we look at things like safety factors, et cetera. That regulation has a process for appeal, and that is to the board if it's determined, VDOT were to determine that the route would not be safe for over-dimensional vehicles, for instance. So in that particular case, there's nothing where there's a real need for force of law. But at the same time, if we are able to repeal this as a reg, it facilitates amendment of the process and the procedure, makes us more flexible, gives us the ability to make amendments. The other issue is there has been, over the last several years, quite an effort on the part of the General Assembly, various executives, administrations that are really seeking to minimize the number of regs that are out there. And so I would say those are the benefits. In particular, they add more flexibility to the process, give us a little more leeway to change things as time and circumstances dictate. On the second question as to details, you're absolutely right. What we're doing at this point is just simply saying we're recognizing and acknowledging the need for the regulation to be changed. Once we will post that the need to change the reg out on town hall, but then we will begin the process for amending the regulation, which is a very significant process, and the CTB will be engaged in that. It is your regulation. And so what we will be doing is we will have to go through a regulatory process, but we will also be presenting to the CTB the details, the changes we're proposing, and ultimately you all would have to, the board will have to approve the final product and would be involved in the process to get to the final product.
Thank you. I think that's a great answer, and I would just for record suggest to you that I am one of those folks that would agree that if we can have less regulation and get to the same place, we're much better off. So thank you.
Thank you. I think Ms. Hines would agree with that. Anything else? Okay, thank you again, Margie. Thank you again, Margie. Thank you again, Joanne. And now we're going to have safety with Margie Ray. Margie, are you there?
Yes, good morning, Madam
Good
Secretary,
morning.
members of the board. Are you able to hear me well enough?
Yes.
Are you all able to hear me well enough?
Yes, I think so.
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. I was having a little telephone difficulties a moment ago, so just confirming. So good morning. I hope everybody is doing well given our current circumstances. Obviously, an interesting format for our meeting today. Kind of miss seeing all of you all. But today's presentation is going to give you some information and background on our target setting process and our proposed targets for 2021. But before getting into the details of the target setting, I did want to provide a little background and refresher information on our past activities. And I apologize, Jen, next slide, please. And so that you all, since it's been a little while since we've discussed some of our safety performance target information, and I just want to refresh you all on that. So our first point here is that it is MAP 21 in the FAST Act that require us to set targets for 5 safety measures, and they have to be established annually. With 3 of these measures, we work closely with the Governor's Highway Safety Office, which is DMV, to establish our targets and agree to those for 3 of the 5 measures. And then we have some schedule requirements. So DMV has to report their targets to NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, by the end of June. And then VDOT reports our targets to the Federal Highway Administration by the end of July. So the 5 measures that we look at on the next slide, please, are the fatalities, the rate of fatalities, the serious injuries, the rate of serious injuries, and the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. It's the first 3 on this list, which are the ones that require coordination with the Governor's Highway Safety Office. Next slide, please. So in this slide, it just reminds us too of what we've accomplished over the last year. So really it started in about 2018. Nick and I provided a series of presentations about the development of a target setting methodology and development of a funding and prioritization policy to improve our safety outcomes. So in June of last year, you all adopted 2020 targets utilizing this new data-driven methodology. And then you also in December adopted a new policy related to the project prioritization and funding of highway safety improvement dollars to improve our safety outcomes. And so you see listed here on the slide just the targets that we approved and adopted in 2020. Next slide, please. So we wanted to see a little bit on how we're doing and share a little information there. And based on those trends, we can see that we've had some ups and downs over time, but that there's been a general decline in all the crash types here since a high of 2007. So obviously the increase in fatalities, that orange line from a low in 2014, has been a concern and certainly been a focus of our efforts to identify infrastructure improvements that can help reduce all crashes. And so this data, it's really important to kind of understand historically where we've been, because this plays into many other things as well. Next slide, please. So before moving to our target setting practice and updates on that, we did want to make you aware of some of the other requirements of MAP 21 in the FAST Act. So obviously, we set our targets in Virginia and nationally with the objective to make sure that the targets really matter and that each state's really focusing on opportunities to help reduce fatalities and serious injuries and to protect our bicyclists and pedestrians. So annually, FHWA has to make a determination of significant progress towards meeting those safety performance targets. And FHWA has just initiated the first round of this significant determination, and I've got some more information on that. But as part of this process, state has to demonstrate that at least 4 of the 5 targets were met, or that the target at least had to be better than the baseline value. And then there are some consequences that if a significant progress is not made, a state has to prepare a plan that's submitted to FHWA, identifying what it will do to meet those targets. And it also has to obligate 100% of the highway safety funds for the year that the targets were set. So that would have been our 2017 highway safety funds. So next slide, please. So on April 24th, we received FHWA's first letter about whether or not we achieved our targets. And based on the data, Virginia did not make significant progress towards its 2018 targets. And it was our fatality numbers and rates that both exceeded the target and the baseline values. And wanted to highlight that the targets for both 2018 and 2019 were adopted or were set using a methodology prescribed by FHWA and NHTSA, which we've identified have many limitations compared to our new methodology, which really is industry leading. It's been nationally recognized. We're conducting peer reviews with other states on how Virginia has been setting its targets. So it's something that has been really very powerful to us and hopefully helpful to us as we move forward in time. But we also sent a response back to FHWA on May 8th that communicated that we really we didn't feel like that the data, the data was the data, but that it wasn't really reflective of the actions that the Commonwealth has taken over the last few years to really improve our safety outcomes. Next slide, please. So this slide just includes the actual numbers and how FHWA assesses our performance. And so they looked at the past trends and predict future annual rates. They use this a 5-year average, and those averages are for the purposes of smoothing any annual fluctuations, but they also tend to lag in the data that we see. And so when we look at where we are, I guess another interesting factor here is they're actually looking to the 3rd decimal place about whether or not we've achieved our outcome. But you can see in the far right column, the last 2 columns there, whether we met the target, and we have no for all of them, and then for whether or not we were better than our baseline numbers. And for our fatality and rate of fatalities, we were not better than the baseline. Just a little context here as well is that we were able to get some information about nationally how other states have fared. And we found out that 25 states failed their significant progress. 27 did pass. Most who failed were within 10% of their targets. And then interestingly, about 40% of those states really needed that baseline assessment to be able to demonstrate significant progress. So this baseline assessment is certainly an important element in understanding how we're progressing through time. It'll also allow some states to set really aggressive targets because they still had the baseline data as a backstop to setting that aggressive target. Next slide, please. So we, as indicated in our response to FHWA, that we didn't feel that it provided that accurate reflection of the actions taken by the Commonwealth, and we wanted to highlight some of those actions. This administration really has made safety a huge focus. There's been several legislative actions that were included in the 2020 General Assembly session. And while there were some disappointments, there's also been some successes. And so certainly this year we saw the passage and signing into law of a handheld ban. So it's prohibiting passengers or the driver from holding a personal handheld communication device. We also established Virginia's own Highway Safety Improvement Program, and this is to help facilitate funding projects that are really going to address those infrastructure or behavioral causes of crashes and base it on a prioritization process. And this is very similar to the policy that you all adopted in December this year as far as an implementation plan and really looking at achieving better outcomes through our investments. We also authorized the use of automated speed enforcement in work zones and school crossings. The original proposed code language would have been through the highway safety corridors, but this is what was passed by the General Assembly. And then we also modified the Code of Virginia to require vehicles to yield right-of-way by stopping for pedestrians rather than just yielding for pedestrians. So there were some definite successes in our General Assembly session this year. We also had some challenges with some of the legislation that didn't pass. On the next slide, please. And obviously, one that's been, I think, has been before the General Assembly for several years now is making seatbelt use a primary offense. It failed passed by the House of Delegates, but failed on the Senate floor. Prohibiting open containers of alcohol in the passenger areas of vehicles, again, did not pass. And then authorizing local governments to post speed limits below 25 miles per hour, again, did not pass. So I think it was important to understand that while we had a lot of success, not everything that we wanted did move forward. So we've also had some other key initiatives that have been helpful towards achieving better safety outcomes. You know, the governor, early in taking office, established the governor's leadership team for highway safety. DMV has is trying to develop technology solutions to eliminating drunk driving. I think many of you all are aware of DADS, which is the Driver Alcohol Detection System for Safety. You may have even seen a demonstration of that at maybe one of the governor's transportation conferences. But certainly your actions too have been positive in that direction as far as developing methodology and approving targets set through that new methodology and the new funding policy that you adopted. And we're being recognized for some of these innovations and things like that we're doing. That we developed, VDOT developed a pedestrian safety action plan in 2019 and won a national award for that. So there are many great things that we are doing. Next slide, please. Now, some of this you all have heard, and it really kind of highlighted some of the challenges with the target setting methodology and really also encouraged us to look into using our own methodology and developing something that was more data-driven rather than trend-based. So this methodology essentially requires us to look backward to when we were doing well, and then with record lows in 2014. I showed you the graphic before that showed how high we were in 2007, and those numbers were some of the highest numbers seen in a generation in Virginia for fatalities and serious injuries. And so we had a low of about 2014, and so in setting our targets, it would have implied a steeper, would have appeared we had a steeper decline than what we were actually experiencing. And so while these trend lines can help inform us on how we're doing, it's not necessarily a good predictor of where we're going. So the FHWA methodology is limited also in that it doesn't consider important factors that can really influence the outcomes, such as demographics, socioeconomic, and other environmental factors. And it doesn't consider our infrastructure spending that can also influence those outcomes. All this to say that at your direction, we developed some statistical models to help us understand those factors and to provide a better target setting methodology and better prediction. Next slide, please. Any questions about the FHWA determination before I move into the target setting?
Hey, Margie, it's Scott Kasperwitz. I do have a question. Under the new legislation that's passed, there's a provision for automated speed enforcement. And obviously, you know, our mission is not speed enforcement, it's local, county and state police that do that. How does that provision interact with what we do, or what role do we play in implementing that new legislation?
Well, we can estimate some potential benefits of reduction in crashes that could be as a result of that legislative implementation. And I have a little information on that a few slides later, so I can show you what we would estimate as some potential benefits.
Okay, so those are things that are outside of our range of control. We're just going to gain benefits from it in our crash statistics overall.
Right, but some of the legislative changes that have occurred, we still can have an estimated, an expected reduction in fatalities or crashes as a whole, and we try to take that into account as we look at things moving forward.
Okay, thanks.
Great. So now I'm turning back to the target setting methodology and how we've developed this model to be more data-driven. The model does get updated each year to include another year of the data for both the actual crash results that we saw, as well as any factor data that we're utilizing. Each year, we're continuing to look at ways to improve the model So in for preparing for 2021, there's 3 steps that we completed. So first of all, is evaluating the anticipated benefits of the recent or soon to completed projects. And so this helps us understand that those, because the data that we have is only through 2019 in our model, because that's second line there says that we use the 2019 data to help validate the model. We know that there's projects that are going to be completed in the time frame for that could influence and help drive down our targeted numbers, our baseline numbers. So we wanted to be able to account for our new projects that will help us with that. We did look at these external factors to help us predict 2019 baseline for validation. We look at using those new factors in the model and how they seem to have influence in there, and then update that 2021 model prediction. We then combine all of the results from those 2 steps 1 and 2 to help us actually set the target. So next slide, please. So the following 6 slides are presented similarly and focus on 3 types of projects that identified safety benefits from our SMARTSCALE and our HSIP programs. You all have seen some of this information before. The first 2 are going to focus on the spot and corridor projects. Those are projects that tend to have a higher cost with limited geographic benefit, maybe an intersection improvement type project. The second 2 slides will focus on what we call the hybrid project. And then the last 2 slides will focus more on the systemic projects. Again, those projects that are low cost with a wider geographic impact. If you'll recall, last year we presented a lot of information on regarding positive benefits of these lower cost treatments, and your policy that was adopted in December focuses greater investments of the HSIP dollars on asystemic treatments. For each of these slides, the data that's provided in the table, it's based on crash history from 2010 through 2018. So for our spot and corridor projects, we reviewed 107 projects, and we estimated the benefits for those projects. And we used a methodology that was similar to how we analyze our SMARTSCALE projects. Next slide, please. So we can see the expected reductions as a result of that investment of about $415 million. Something that we've added to the slide is the bottom row there where we talk about the cost per annual reduction, so that we can see that there's a reduction of about 1 fatality per year, 11.2 per year for the serious injuries. And from that, we can then do just the straight math that gives us what is that annual reduction that the cost per annual reduction. So we can see that using our spot projects is relatively expensive for that purpose. Moving then to the next slide and focusing on the hybrid projects. First of all, I did note a typo on here in the first bullet that the time frame range should be January 2019 through March 2021. So it's consistent across all 3 of these project types that I explained. So again, we can see that we've had 16 projects that we identified and the crash types that we see during that time period. Next slide, please. With our expected reductions, our reductions are only about 1.5 per year, so not too different than what we saw with our spot projects, but we can see that the annual cost per annual reduction is significantly reduced here, and that it becomes much more cost effective. And we can see for that total investment of $36.6 million, that 24.4 of that is going to help us, per annual reduction for our fatalities. Next slide, please. So with our low-cost systemic type projects, we looked at 18 highway safety improvement projects at $21.8 million, and we can see the number of crashes that have occurred and the outcomes for during that time period. Again, these are a lot of projects that are like our flashing yellow arrows, the high visibility back plates, the high friction surface treatments, things like that. Next slide, please. And again, here we see that the annual reduction, and I'm focusing a little bit on the fatalities just so there's some consistency in the message, but we can see that reduction per year at 1.1, but the cost for that annual reduction is only 19.8. Next slide, please. So I've summarized this information on this slide so that we can see what all the project expected reductions are and the cost per annual reduction. And, clearly the policy that you all have adopted now really highlights the effectiveness of the systemic treatments and hopefully a much, much greater return on investment when we look at the systemic cost per annual reduction versus those spot or spot type projects, that they're much more effective. And even when you compare like our bike head numbers relative to a spot project. There's just a significant differences here in the numbers that really make it cost effective for us to move forward with more systemic type projects. Any questions?
Ms. Ray, I have a couple questions related to the Federal Highway Administration determination. So our response, the response that was sent on May 8th, is there an expectation that they'll change their determination based on that response, or is that just was provided for information only?
I don't believe that there is that opportunity. I think the numbers are what the numbers are, and so that they will be, at some point they'll be making all of that information public, and we're not quite certain of the format for that yet. However, each state, when FHWA sent out their letters to all states at the same time, and we were provided an opportunity to, one, highlight if we found any discrepancies with the numbers, but then also we took that opportunity to highlight some of the challenges with the process, but obviously that Virginia really is taking this information and the target setting practices to heart, and that we're doing as much as we can in trying to improve our safety outcomes.
So I assume that we'll be moving towards the draft of the Highway Implementation Plan, which is required by June 30th. And then fully obligating the 2017 funds. Are they fully obligated at this point?
I believe so.
Margie, I can jump in real quick. Mr. Tonk, a couple responses for you with regard. I'll start with FHWA and their intention with that May 8th letter. The intention of the May 8th letter was certainly to highlight all of the positive momentum that we have had within the last 2 years on safety and the focus of safety, both within the establishment of appropriate performance measures and metrics, but also how we've focused on looking at a greater return on the investment through systemic improvements, the legislative changes that have been successful and not successful, as well as highlighting the fact that the shortcomings out of FHWA's approved methodology in setting at least the 2017 or 2018 targets was inappropriate. FHWA is going to evaluate those targets and the performance as they were set. So we do not look for them to make any changes to how that was established. But we that intention of that May 8th letter was certainly to highlight the fact that we have made significant changes, and it's not an arbitrary or it's a much more robust data-driven approach to doing business. As far as answering the question on the funds that were obligated for safety in 2017, the short answer is yes, we have met that metric. We continue to obligate those funds, and we do have a check in the box in a positive way with that. I would expect that as we move forward, since we did I believe the 2018 performance targets in a similar method using a declining trend line, 5-year analysis, that I would expect that we see a very similar letter next year until it catches up with us on the methodology that Margie's putting forward today.
I will just say, Mr. Tonk, that, as of this moment, FHWA has their own process for evaluating safety. It doesn't mean that we can't try to influence, changes going forward. And so I know that there's really been, to my knowledge, no other administration or CTB who's really has put such a strong focus on safety. So we hope to have ongoing discussions with FHWA to see, how we could possibly influence how safety is measured over time. Our approach, and you all have been through this, is very data-driven, and their approach is very linear-driven. So anyway, trying to improve things as we go forward. And I know that the commissioner and his team have really done an excellent job of evaluating this. There's a letter that I think is a part of your packet of information from Carol that went out. But this is going to be an ongoing process.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Okay.
So there's one added as we are all working on safety.
Madam Secretary?
Yes.
I still have some slides to go.
Oh, so sorry. I was all ready to go to the leadership team. I do think, Margie, you should point out the cost in this, the investment in the different improvements. Do you just want to highlight the chart one more time?
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that you can see is that just high level for our fatality reductions, that the spot project costs about 21 times more than a systemic project, and hybrid projects are about 1.2 times more than a systemic. For our serious injuries, we have about, the spot again is about 25 times more than the systemic, and hybrid about 3.2. For the bike ped, that's a little bit more difficult sometimes to account for it because within an individual project, we have to give it credit for where it actually has potential benefits to bike and pedestrians depending on the types of projects. But really what we see here is that the bike ped projects spot projects are 80 times more costly than a bike ped component in that project. So it becomes very significant, especially when you start looking at the cost for a bike ped improvement relative to our spot projects. So really our conclusion there is that while our annualized reductions are not differing significantly between the various treatment types, but when we view it as that cost per production per person reduction on an annual basis, it's easy to see the positive effects of that low cost treatment. So again, I do think this is a really one of the more important slides here relative to our how we are looking at projects and our investment strategies. Next slide, please. So I'm transitioning now to step 2, which is just dealing with our baseline, our model and improving it. So 3 steps here. One was just looking at what factors that we've used, as long as some new factors. We validate that model, and then we forecast it. Next slide. And here's a summary of the types of factors that we looked at, and we do continue to look for and test new data every year. We've investigated and tested new socioeconomic factors that are shown in red. And for those new factors that were tested, some were found to improve the models and or some that may have only been marginally significant. But we really wanted to understand some of these new things and how they are able to do that. We're still challenged a little bit, and that some data that we'd like to be adding into the model to see how it has some influence, maybe we don't have enough historical data. So I think as we continue to move forward in using this model in the future, eventually we'll have enough data to, historical data to be able to really test some things, new things too. We also have several other efforts underway at VDOT and with working with DMV for some data analytics that we think will help us understand what is causing crashes even more, or at least those things that we can look at as potential solutions to improving our crash outcomes. Next slide, please. So this slide here just gives you a little bit of listing of the factors that we looked at and that are updated. We do have 3 models, one for our fatalities, serious injuries, and our bicycle and pedestrians. So the red arrows are indicators that produce positive trends, increasing those, our outcomes. And those were included in last year's model and this year's. And then the green arrows are those factors that help reduce our measures. Again, were included in the 2020 and 2021 models. The blue measure factors, or blue arrows that are included in the serious injury column, are those new measures that we looked at this year that have some influence. And some of these we had tested in the past, but were found to be insignificant at that time, but with an extra year of data, we now find them to be significant and were included in the model. So some of those things that really helped influence the serious injury model are the proportion of the young population, and that matches now well with our other ones. We did look at the gallons of liquor sold at ABC stores, our behavioral branch spending, and then our average monthly snowfall. Again, that's included in our bicycle and pedestrian model as well. So new factors that we looked at are included this year. Next slide, please. So as we looked at setting up the statistical model, we really wanted to highlight a few key assumptions. And that is that we're modeling it based on these newer modified factors that I just shared. And we're also looking at what we have external factors and then just an annual calibration factor that we use. And we're making the assumption that a lot of these things are going to continue forward as we would have expected. Obviously, due to the uncertainty given the current pandemic conditions and travel patterns and things like that, it's also unclear when a recovery can be anticipated. So our model was run using the presumed past trends and external factors that we've looked at. So we have not taken into account current travel patterns in the model for the time being. We also looked at the scheduled projects and any additional funding that was assumed to continue. So there are some assumptions in this model that we'll need to revisit. But one of the things too that we've observed through really all of our models is that we are starting to see a flattening. And 2019 seems to be somewhat of a pivotal year. We've had a couple of years where the numbers stayed a little bit flatter. And so you'll see that reflected here in some of our target setting. So next slide, please. This is our fatality model. And you can see there's an orange and a blue line. The orange line is covering up most of the blue line. But for between 2018 and 2019, you can see what the observed numbers were. And then based on somewhat of flattening, we are anticipating that we are still seeing an increase in fatalities for 2021 based on some of these other factors, but that it's not as steep of an increase as what we presented to you all in last year's model. So there's just still a certain amount of unexplained variance that we addressed through this calibration factor as well. Next slide, please. So when we look at our serious injuries, I think you can see that it really has flattened out. So we're fairly consistent for the last several years. We did see some decrease in serious injuries between 2018 and 2019, but our time factors and many of the projections that we're looking at are fairly consistent through time, and our assumptions that go into that. And the next slide, please. So again, it's relatively flat, although we do see a slight increase for some of the influence maybe from some of our other external factors that are seeing those increases, but still moderately flat that we can see here going forward. Next slide, please. So in order to account for the recent legislative changes, and Mr. Kasperowitz, this kind of gets to your question, although I misspoke a little bit in that we don't have a line item here that talks about your provision for the automated speed enforcement. So that's something I'll have to look into a little bit and get back to you on. But what we did highlight here is that from some of the key legislation, whether it passed or not, which what were those expected reductions that could have come about through that past legislation? And so to account for this, we also want to understand how we would account for this in the model. So this information is based off of various studies and certain assumptions. D&D helped pull this information together based on different studies and things that are out there to come up with what are those expected reductions in the fatalities and serious injuries. And so in the first row, we can see that the handheld phone ban did pass. And what we look at there are potential expected reductions on an annual basis. And then the remaining rows are the legislation that didn't, the main key legislation that didn't pass, and some missed opportunities potentially for some other annual reductions that we could have anticipated through those changes in legislation. Next slide, please. So in the model, we wanted to take into account the new legislation. And so this slide here is the combination of what we saw in this top row were the outcomes of our baseline model predictions. The second row are those expected project reductions from our 3 types of projects. And then we've added this new row here of the legislative changes and what we would expect on an annual basis there. We went with the low end of the range, trying to be somewhat conservative in our estimate of those expected benefits. And when you get to the step 3, you're basically subtracting out from the baseline those other the project benefits and the handheld ban. And the second row from the bottom is what we are proposing as our 2021 targets. The bottom row in the table here compares to you all what the targets were last year that you adopted for 2020. Next slide, please. So really, it's just for you all to give us feedback on these proposed targets. We do anticipate bringing a resolution to you in June for adoption of the targets, and that's to meet the federal reporting deadlines as DMV has to report to NHTSA before the end of the month of June. And we want to continue to evaluate the impacts on the target setting model based on what's happening now and how that could impact our ability to meeting the current targets that have been adopted, but also really also how it might affect our 2022 model predictions. So we'll definitely be taking a look at that information, and also to impacting, we'll evaluate the impacts to our implementation of the new legislation. Certainly there was some additional funding that was anticipated that we hoped would help improve safety. And so we'll be continuing to evaluate all of those impacts. And with that, I'll take any other questions you may have.
Thank you, Margie. Mr. Kaswitz, I just wanted to make sure I understood your question on the speed enforcement. I'm not sure if you were referring to the speed enforcement that was included in the omnibus bill. There was a provision in the bill that would have allowed automated speed enforcement on corridors designated as highway safety corridors. That would have included I-81, a small portion around Prince William on 95, and then the 64-295 interchange. That did not pass. It was not included in what actually passed in the omnibus bill. So I'm not sure, were you referring to that or just speed enforcement in general?
Well, actually, first, it's disappointing that that didn't pass. You know that every year we go through this, speed enforcement is one of my primary concerns. No, I was unaware of the specifics of the provisions that did pass, and just wanted to understand how they might impact, our statistics. But I guess, the fact that that didn't pass brings me back to a broader question. And Margie, in the reporting that we do to FHWA, do we have any option to report on average speeds of some of our major roadways? We've talked about this in the past and have identified that we have the ability to, through our camera systems, to track average speed on some of our roadways. Is that even a reporting statistic that we are aware of or could provide to FHWA?
So I don't believe that's something that is included as a normal course of business. But I believe that we have an opportunity to provide narrative because there's a performance reporting dashboard that is publicly available, and we are allowed to provide some comment and feedback on what the public might see. So I think that we certainly could look at how we might be able to incorporate something there.
I'd like to, outside of this meeting, discuss that with you. I think, as we go through these stats every year, it's clear that one of the major areas of improving our safety statistics we have no control over, and that's violation and speed enforcement. So, given the limited range of options that we have, it would be nice to at least have visibility on how we're doing in that regard, what our average speeds on some of our major arterials are. The relationship between speed and fatalities in serious injury is long proven, and we don't consider that in these discussions. I think it would benefit from a perspective of at least understanding that relationship.
Absolutely.
Mr. Kaswitz, the next presentation, we've added something because speeding has been such an issue during this pandemic. And the governor's, I think one of his very first directives was actually establishing the Federal Highway Safety leadership program. And our liaison in that effort is Marshall Herman. So she's going to be coming next, and she's going to be addressing speeding. And perhaps through that, we can try to determine how we can integrate some of that data into this safety process as well. Before we move on, does anybody else have a comment or a question for Margie Ray? Can I make a suggestion? Why don't we take a 15-minute break? We'll come back, we'll get the speeding numbers, we'll go through the reports from Commissioner Britch and Director Mitchell. We'll go into the action meeting. But for right now, let's just take a 15-minute break, and don't sign off, just mute your line. And or if you choose to turn your camera off, that's fine. And we will reconvene at 5 till 12. Thank you.
Highway Safety Association, which is a nonprofit that represents state and territorial highway offices, safety offices, and they give federal grant programs to address behavioral highway safety issues. Next slide. So the GHSA recently issued a release on traffic safety issues during COVID-19. Next slide. And in that release, they mentioned a recent analysis that reported a severe spike in speeding and other reckless driving behavior. So as you can see, that analysis stated that emptier streets may be encouraging some drivers to flout traffic safety laws, including speed limits. And despite there being far fewer vehicles on the roadways due to this pandemic and the stay-at-home orders that have been issued, state highway safety officials all over the country are seeing this severe spike in speeding. And many of those states have reported alarming increases, including some surges in vehicles clocked at 100 miles an hour or more. In addition to that information, I did want to mention some information that was just issued this morning. So this is not on the slide, but the National Safety Council at 10:40 a.m. this morning issued a release stating very similar information, saying in their preliminary estimates, it shows that as Americans began driving less and covering fewer miles on the emptier roads became more lethal. And their early data indicate that year over year, they saw a 14% jump in fatality rates per miles driven in March, in spite of an 8% drop in the total number of roadway deaths compared to March of 2019. Those are national numbers. Later in the presentation, I will mention where Virginia is. Next slide, please. Okay. So some of the things that we've been seeing, Virginia State Police have been noticing an uptick in these more extreme speeding by motorists on the interstates that aren't as crowded during these stay-at-home directives. And they do continue to have a visible presence on our roadways to keep all of our Virginians safe or even people traveling through Virginia. But drivers have been reminded that an open road, this is not an open invitation to speed. It is still not safe to do so. And state police have been, all across Virginia, they're actively enforcing those posted speed limits. Next slide, please. So some additional information not included on this slide is that since the governor issued a state of emergency, Virginia has seen reductions in traffic volumes, and those reductions were anywhere between 5% to 62%, depending on the day. And overall, the average daily reduction in traffic during that month and a half period from the time Governor Northam issued a state of emergency until April 30th, that average daily reduction came to about 39%. So since there have been fewer vehicles on the road and our overall fatalities have decreased by approximately 21%. So that's good news as compared to the same time frame in 2019. At the same time, we've been seeing some very concerning trends in the fatalities that have occurred. So as you'll see on this slide, preliminary data from our great partners at the Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles, it's indicating that during the period of March 13th, 2020 until April 30th of this year, speed-related crashes have accounted for more than 23% of the total crashes during that time frame. And that's an increase over the same time in 2019, an increase of 18.5%, and it's also higher than the 5-year average. Also, speed-related fatalities are making up about 48% of the overall fatalities during this time period, and that's also higher than the 5-year average of 41%. Next slide, please. So in addition to speeding, we're monitoring the rate of fatalities and injuries for the occupants of vehicles not wearing seatbelts between March 13th and April 30th compared to the same time period of 2019. And this is very upsetting. The unrestrained fatalities have not decreased at all. We're at the same rate we were last year. So we had 34 unrestrained fatalities during this period, both in 2019 and in 2020. And those unrestrained fatalities make up about 56% of the total fatalities during this time period, which is only slightly higher percentage than the 54% from 2019. I also, just as a side note, this data includes only the vehicles that are equipped with safety belts. So this excludes bicycles and motorcycles, just a little detail that can be important for those listening. Next slide, please. So continuing on the unbelted fatalities, the numbers of unbelted fatalities in combination where speed was also involved in that crash, those fatalities increased by 41% during this time period compared to 2019. It's not a good number. And the unrestrained fatalities for the calendar year through April 30th, those have also increased over the time period in since 2019, excuse me. So those went up about 16%. Next slide. So something that we as transportation professionals, something we can't stress enough is of others that are on the roadways that our motorists should watch out for, both in normal times as well as during pandemics. So the Virginia Department of Transportation has been conducting much of its maintenance and construction work along the roadway with live traffic, and that continues even now. And so even though traffic has decreased due to this pandemic, we still are very aware of the potential for work zone crashes, and that is a serious risk for those workers out there. And we're reminding people that for the safety of crew members, as well as the traveling public, all motorists need to use as much caution, pay attention, and drive slowly through the work zones. Next slide, please. So many of you may have seen in the media that due to the stay-at-home orders, the lighter traffic, the spring weather, we're seeing a lot of individuals and families that are trying to get outside for some fresh air, get some exercise. So you see a lot of people walking and bicycling. And it's a great time, once again, to remind people that these are vulnerable road users and they need to be watching out for them. About 90% of pedestrian injuries and deaths occur when they're crossing a roadway. So once again, everybody, the pedestrians, the motorists, everyone needs to be mindful of those intersections. Pay attention to the crosswalk signals, pay attention to your traffic lights, and and just watch out for each other. So, you know, the cyclists also must do the same thing. They need to comply with all the traffic laws, and we all need to share the road. As we've been saying throughout all of this, the tagline of this pandemic is that we're all in this together, but that includes sharing the roadway and staying safe on our roads. Next slide, please. So we are currently, most areas of Virginia are currently in phase 1 of the governor's Forward Virginia plan. And that's reminding everybody that it is still safer to stay at home. Our agencies are reminding people that if you must drive, wear that safety belt, go the speed limit, watch out for pedestrians and bicyclists, and don't drive if you've been drinking. One additional thing to note is that state police is gradually stepping up their enforcement efforts as more people are getting on the roadways, and especially with Memorial Day weekend approaching and some schools, quote, letting out at the end of this month, they are expecting some increased traffic on those main interstate corridors, especially near beaches, as beaches are opening along the East Coast. Next slide, please. So some actions that our agencies are taking, we're, you know, in this ongoing effort to assist many agencies with getting information out to their communities. So Virginia State Police, DMV, and VDOT are issuing social media posts that are combining traffic safety messages along with COVID-19 messages. And once again, those posts are focusing on slowing down, not driving under the influence of anything, wearing your seatbelts, watching out for bicyclists and pedestrians, as well as motorcycle safety, because with the better weather, we're starting to see more motorcyclists out on the roadways. In addition, VDOT is drafting really great safety messages that can be seen on our changeable message signs on the interstates. And some additional messaging is being drafted and is tentatively scheduled to come out on Monday, June 1st, but we currently do have some speeding messages that are being displayed on those CMS signs. One other thing we are very aware of, and member agencies are working on messaging for reminding drivers of just some basic driving safety skills. As more people do start to get back on the roads, they might be rusty in their driving habits. It's been almost 2 months, a little bit more than 2 months for some people, since many have really had to go out and drive on a regular basis. So we're very aware of that, and we're keeping an eye. We will be keeping an eye on any other concerning trends that will start coming up as more people get on our roads. Next slide, please. So the next few slides we have here, they're highlighting some of the social media posts from our member agencies of the governor's executive leadership team on highway safety and their amazing communications teams. So first up are posts from Virginia State Police. And on the left, you can see a work zone crash that happened in Arlington, and speed was the main cause. And you can tell that vehicle did not come out looking too great. The driver lost control of the vehicle, struck a construction trailer sign and a crash impact attenuator, and then it slid across the lanes and T-boned an SUV. The other post that you see on the right was from a wreck in Fairfax County. That just happened this weekend, by the way, and the driver of the U-Haul truck hit a gas pedal instead of the brake. And because that driver was wearing their seatbelt, he was able to walk away from that wreck without injury. So seatbelts do save lives. Virginia State Police, I have to say, does a really great job at creating these very timely posts, and we need to commend them for all the work that they're doing. Next slide, please. Here's some additional posts from state police. These include some of the speeding tickets that troopers have been issuing, and those include a recent Mother's Day themed post asking if getting a ticket going 115 miles per hour on a road that's 55 miles per hour would make your mother proud. It's good to insert some humor now and then. Next slide, please. From our Department of Motor Vehicles, encouraging people to buckle up, slow down and move over for emergency personnel. They use some really great, beautiful, eye-catching graphics there. Next slide, please. And here's some other posts from VDOT. They're showing those CMS messages I mentioned earlier that they're displayed on our interstate. And these are very creative, very popular. There's a great team at VDOT working on those. Next slide, please. And here's one more slide from VDOT. I know there's big concern about these unbelted fatalities, and VDOT once again created a great graphic with the buckle up, phone down message. You know, just once again reminding people to wear their seatbelts and ditch distractions. And next slide. This concludes my presentation. I want to thank everybody. I know, as the Secretary said, safety is a huge priority for this administration, and we will continue to do this great work to bring public awareness and outreach to some of these issues and hopefully change some behaviors along the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any thoughts?
My pleasure.
Questions?
Madam Secretary, this is Greg.
Hi, Mr. Yates.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Let me just thank Marshall for the presentation. I think it's a great presentation. But I would like to make a comment on the seatbelt usage. I don't think we will see this fatality number decline until we really emphasize this one major factor, either with more communication, which VDOT does a wonderful job of that, I think, or more enforcement, or maybe even some new laws that we can advocate. But to me, that's just the whole key to the presentation. We've just got to emphasize this more and more. And again, Marshall, thanks for a great presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yates. And you know, the fact that I will say that some of these measures got as far as they have ever gotten. You know, to the seatbelts got to the floor of the Senate. So doesn't mean we won't keep trying. Doesn't mean we won't keep pushing all the right messages, doing the education. But I certainly appreciate your comment, Mr. Yates. Anything else? I'm really sorry. I don't think that raising the hand is working well because I can't get you all on the screen at the same time for me. It's an issue that Carol and I will work on. If we find ourselves here again, I'll try to be able to do that. So if you all text Carol or let her know, if you chat with Carol, I can certainly recognize you. With that, I will move on to the reports. Director Mitchell.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a few updates. First, on the transit side, we've been coordinating with WMATA and the Northern Virginia jurisdictions that WMATA is going to be beginning their platform improvement program for the Orange and Blue Line, and they're taking advantage of the lower traffic levels as a result of COVID-19 to accelerate work on that. They'll actually be, they've enlarged the scope of the project to include all of the stations west of Boston, including the Silver Line stations, and that's also going to give them the opportunity, and the airport's authority, the opportunity to accelerate and address some of the work with the tie-in for the Dulles Rail Project Phase 2. In terms of overall ridership trends, most of the systems that we've seen have gone fare free, and which is reducing fare box revenue, but it's also creating a more safe environment for operators and more opportunities for social distancing. We've seen about 90 ridership for Metro Rail and VRE, including overall statewide ridership is down about 60 to 70%. GRTC in Richmond is an example of actually a system where their ridership is only down about 40%, but all of the systems have reduced ridership right now. I know last month the CTB approved 5311 CARES Act funding for our rural agencies, and we did get that approved by FTA last week. So we'll be distributing those funds very soon. And in terms of Amtrak ridership as well, the routes have been reduced, which was announced last month as well. We have one route on the Roanoke route, line serving the Norfolk as well. We have seen about a 90% drop in ridership in April compared to April of last year. However, when we look at our overall year-to-date ridership for the federal fiscal year, we're only down about 73%, and that's somewhat due to the ridership increases that we saw in the fall and earlier this year. So, and that concludes my report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Director Mitchell, Commissioner. Commissioner, I think you're still muted. There you go.
I appreciate that. I have 3 items for the board today, one of which is an update on an Interstate 81 project. You may recall, for those members that were on the board back in 2014, at that time, the commissioner had indicated that the board would be briefed on any projects that were valued at over $100 million or presented a high risk to construction. So I wanted to bring for you today just a project that will exceed the $100 million mark on Interstate 81. The particular project is between mile marker 136 and 141 in Roanoke County, as well as the city of Salem. It is adding a 3rd lane in the northbound direction and the southbound direction, and will also consist of several replacement and widening efforts of bridges or overpasses. The project will also have a mill and overlay of the pavement, addition of storm drain and stormwater management facilities and sound walls along the corridor. The purpose of the project, again, is to improve capacity and reduce congestion, but overall improve the reliability and the safety along this section of roadway. The value of the project that we're looking at is roughly $292 million that is there, and we're proposing, at least at this point, to be able to put this forward in a design build procurement. We're still reviewing that and have not made a final decision, but we anticipate it going as a design build. In particular, there are just a number of risks that are inherent to it. Certainly where we are with COVID-19, there's some external risk, and that's certainly with COVID-19 and the labor availability and the potentially needing to take a closer look at the revenue schedule that is anticipated from the revenues to be generated along the corridor. We'll need to look at a timing factor with that, as we're doing with all of our projects today. COVID-19 is also going to have potentially an impact on how we look to engage the public on public comments as we move forward. Social distancing and maybe virtual public hearings may be something that we're going to need to take a look at. Market conditions represent another risk to us. Prior to COVID-19, we were entering a phase that we were having a labor shortage, potentially in some geographic areas due to significant construction activities as well as private development. So we're going to need to continue to take a look at that as we develop the project. And just two technical issues, certainly one of which is the unforeseen geotechnical issues that we may experience along the corridor. The chief engineer, Bart Thrasher, in his previous dialogue with the Commonwealth Transportation Board on the I-81 corridor projects, have raised the issue of karst topography or geography throughout the corridor. This section may be fall within that risk element. So we're going to need to do some additional geotechnical exploration to be able to minimize that risk. And of course, in this section of roadway, widening out to 3 lanes, just the maintenance of traffic as we add a 3rd lane and either replace and or widen bridges. So it's nothing out of the ordinary. I just need to bring it to your attention that as we move forward the project, it does represent a project that's valued at more than $100 million. Second item for you today is to address what we're doing with the reduction in our traffic volumes that we've seen. Similar to what Jennifer has indicated, that we are taking advantage of the opportunity to extend our lane closures that we've had out on several of our projects so that we can add to the productivity of our contractors in a safe environment, of course. And so we're taking advantage of that. We had 56 projects statewide that we have implemented additional lane closure hours on. And what we've been able to do is we had approximately 900 hours that we anticipated of lane closures. And through this pandemic, we've taken the opportunity to extend that by another 1,200 hours, a little more than 1,200 hours of lane closures for us to accomplish additional work, enhance the productivity, all while in a reduced traffic volume. Some of those projects that are taking the benefit of it in the Bristol district, I-81, we have a super elevation project along right around milepost 32. Fredericksburg district, we have the southbound Rappahannock River crossing project that is taking advantage of it. In the Hampton Roads district, segment 3, some of those we're ahead of schedule in a number of those places, and we're taking advantage of the ability to shift traffic onto new sections in single phases rather than multiple phases, that if we had to do it under traffic volumes. Northern Virginia, Route 7 and Battlefield Interchange, and the I-66 eastbound widening has been one of the most positively impacted projects that we have in taking advantage of it, of the reduced traffic volumes. And then rounding it out, I-64 bridge replacement over Airport Road here in Richmond, and then in Salem, a replacement bridge over the New River is also being a benefit. So we are monitoring the traffic uptick. We have seen traffic increase here within the last week to 2 weeks with the warmer weathers and the reopening that was announced last Friday. So we are monitoring those traffic volumes, and if they do become to a level that's not safe, we will reinstitute the lane closure policies that had in place before. And then my final statement is that we are recognizing that we have seen some very significant reductions in traffic volumes. How has that impacted all of our facilities since the pandemic started in March? So at the June meeting, I anticipate having a presentation for you to be able to document what we have seen traffic volume wise throughout the Commonwealth on our interstate facilities and geographically based. And now that as we are hitting certain milestones, such as the reopening, Memorial Day weekend, how is this changing the dynamics and potential resurgence of traffic in our respective districts? So I hope to have that presentation for you back in June. If not, it'll certainly be held in the July timeframe. So with that being said, Madam Secretary, I'll open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Dodson.
Ask you 2 questions. First of all, for us not familiar with the road numbers on 81, what section of road you talk about the almost $300 million project around the Salem, Roanoke area?
Mr. Dodson, it's at mile marker 136 to 141.
I know, but I mean, to be honest with you, I don't look the mile markers when I drive down 81. Is that, the geographical section you're talking about?
It's roughly around Wildwood Road Godwin Avenue, Thompson Memorial Drive.
Okay. I'll just, the next time I'll drive through the, try to figure out the number. Right where you go off the city of Salem up to, we go into 581, or how long is this section?
It's about 5 miles in, 4 to 5 miles in total length.
Okay. Another question, how's the telecommuting doing throughout the entire state in relation to pandemic issues?
I think that is, Mr. Dodson, I think that the traffic volume, the reduction in traffic volumes that we're experiencing is directly related to teleworking being implemented not only in Northern Virginia, but throughout the Commonwealth. And we've seen traffic volume reductions as much as 50 to 60% throughout the Commonwealth. We have seen an uptick. In some places, we are now only 30% below volumes. I'll say for the Commonwealth or the department, we have taken a very strong approach to teleworking. We've closed many of our facilities for those individuals that can telework or taking advantage of it. On any given day, we have about 3,500 to 3,800 staff people teleworking every day. The rest of our forces are field forces that are out performing our maintenance duties and construction activities.
So that means you got almost half the workforce on teleworking.
Almost half the workforce is teleworking. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Steve?
Mr. Smoot.
Thank you. Steve, in your June presentation, I would be interested in having some sense of the impact of the reduced travel on toll revenues, who the liable parties are when revenues considerably are under what was anticipated, and any related impacts from that. And we don't need to talk about it today, but in June, I hope you will speak to that.
I can certainly prepare a presentation and talk through a number of those items with you, as well as what that recovery may look like. A lot of conversation being had in the industry overall on that as we speak.
Thanks.
Do you have a question? No, okay. That anybody else?
Yes. This
To
is
our
Cedric.
Mr. Rucker?
Yes, Madam Secretary. I just wanted to get a sense of the impact of COVID on those people who were out doing the work. That is, those individuals in the VDOT departments doing the road maintenance, our contractors, our subcontractors. How has COVID impacted the health and welfare of those individuals? And what are we doing to undergird their safety?
Madam Secretary.
Before you answer, I just, I wanted to make sure that Mr. Rucker and the board know that as we were going through this process with transportation, construction, maintenance, the operation of our tunnels, moving our ferries, maintaining the rest stops, our safety service patrols, we have frontline workers in transportation. In fact, tomorrow, last year there was a resolution, House Joint Resolution 59, in which that last Thursday before Memorial Day is designated as Celebrate Transportation Day. Celebrate seemed like a perhaps not the right tone for this period, but we are honoring all of our frontline workers tomorrow. All through teleconferencing, and there'll be a video that I hope to show to all of you. But, you know, the truckers, the bus drivers, the metro workers, the transit workers, all the operators in our system, those who clean, everybody cleaning all of our facilities, DMV, you know, DMV has back offices doing everything online, and they just opened 9 offices just this week, bringing people back in. there has been just this tremendous effort across the entire transportation sector, the port, those who are actually moving critical goods. So the message really has been, if we can't do it safely, don't do it. And everyone has been extremely deliberate about how we are trying to take care of our workers. Specifically within VDOT, Commissioner, I will turn it over to you so you can go through some of the measures that have been in place.
Thank you, Secretary. Mr. Rucker, I'd say that we have had a very deliberate plan even prior to the pandemic being issued and the stay-at-home orders being put into place. Our Safety, Security, and Emergency Management Division had been already working on a plan for this potential and needing to both telework as well as how to protect our frontline employees in the field as we continue to move forward, social distancing, the elimination of multiple people in vans or trucks in the field. But I'd say in a nutshell that we have been working diligently as guidance continued to come out. And I'll say it was an extremely fluid situation since this started in March. That there were competing guidance and issuances through CDC and others. And I recall very deliberately that one Friday in March or in April, CDC reversed its direction and suggested face coverings for all employees that cannot adequately social distance. And our staff was on the phone with multiple companies securing face masks and face coverings for our employees that were in the field. To date, we have ordered hand sanitizers, wipes, face coverings, at least 2 face coverings per employee that are there, neck gaiters, as well as true face coverings. Those employees that were identified as being potentially high-risk individuals that fell within the categories that were prescribed have taken advantage of what has been put out as public health emergency leave. And those individuals have been put on emergency leave status for that, or have been able to identify isolated work activities that did take them outside of potential interactions with others. Other examples, as I said, that we have put into place as best we can is 1 person per vehicle for field work, be able to have them out there. Again, the face coverings in other places where we cannot adequately social distance is mandatory. And believe it or not, right now, I think we've gotten into a very steady state situation where we're into a new normal routine. If you drive through any of our construction activities, both our personal VDOT maintenance activities as well as contractor performed, they do have face coverings or are socially distanced. As the Secretary said, we've been very deliberate with not only our staff, but also our contractors to say that if we cannot do that work, then you're not going to do that work. Yesterday, I came through segment 3, and I will say 99% of the individuals had face coverings, even though that they were socially distanced through it. In each of the other work zones that I've been through, they have some element of face coverings, whether they be gaiter or actual face masks on. We have held weekly calls. We've transitioned down to weekly calls, both with our contracting counterparts as well as our district staff. But in the beginning, we started off with calls with our district staff at least every 3 days and stayed in constant communication as we developed the plan, as well as with our contracting industry to be able to make sure that they had the latest information and clear on the expectations on how to maintain certainly the social distancing and the requirements that have been set forth. Again, it goes back to making sure that those employees are safe as possible. Some of which have also been that we've looked to provide individual water bottles rather than our coolers that we may have been using in the past, community coolers, individual water bottles at that point as well, hand sanitizers, and again, wipes and cleaning protocol and expectations about entering and exiting vehicles, as well as shift changes that may occur. We've been able to stagger our work hours in a number of places to be able to make sure that we have one group of people not interacting with another shift coming on, so that we do have some level of degree of separation between the two shifts to help prevent any lack of social distancing when we enter the gate or exit the gate. So hopefully that helps answer the question, Mr. Cedric Rucker.
Indeed, it does. I mean, do we have any reports of transmission in the course of this?
We do have a number of employees that have been either exposed to it or have contracted it. And it's hard to say. In a number of instances, we're aware that a family member may have been exposed to it, or due to their activities off the job site, they have been exposed to it. That we have had a number of employees that may have come to work after being exposed, and we have sent them home into self-quarantine for 14 days in accordance with the CDC guidelines. To date, I don't have the exact number, but I would venture to say that we may have as many as just 20 people that have contracted COVID. That may be more than what I have, but by and large, our numbers have been very small with our direct employees. We are aware of some employees that have contracted it on our construction projects. Those employees continue to be requested to stay home for the 14-day self-quarantine after their level of exposure. So many of the contractors are following, if not all the contractors are following, similar guidance has been what has been provided in CDC. And so the rate of transmission has not been very high, both with our staff nor with our contractors. We do have isolated instances where there has been a slowdown in productivity in those cases, or a break in a supply chain, but not to a significant degree.
I thank you kindly.
And Mr. Rucker, in the interest of time, we won't go through all the different agencies, but the Department of Rail and Public Transportation has been issuing guidelines, working with industry. Every agency from the port to the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board to DMV, everyone has been extremely cautious and careful, working with the Virginia Department of Health to try to ensure we have the safest workplace possible. And I did just want to follow up on one thing the commissioner said, that if someone were to have been exposed or thought to have been exposed to COVID, that person is not only asked to quarantine, but the offices go through a very detailed sanitation process. So we also do that in the interest of safety. Mr. Dodson, did you have another question?
I just have a statement I'm going to share with everybody. It's been in the press. A few weeks ago, there was a positive at the shop here at the Lynchburg district, and everything was handled so well. The media obviously heard about it, but I would say, Mr. Commissioner, from your district engineer, your public relations people, they handled real well. Obviously, the facility just less than a mile from our corporate offices here, and district engineer Chris kept me informed, and it was an excellent response, and this was right at the height of the issue, and they did a great job. As far as public information, it just went down. It wasn't a big issue after the first announcement. So they did a classic job on the whole situation. I want to give them kudos on that.
Thank you, Mr. Dodson. Anybody else?
Madam Secretary, I've got a comment, or maybe it's a question, but
Mr. Malvin,
has anybody attempted to try to figure out what the new normal will be? And when I say that, I mean, for example, the 3,800 we have teleworking. Are all them coming back, or they might have a view on that? And some of our P3 partners, does anybody have an estimate? if traffic's going to get to pre-COVID levels, and if so, how long, if ever? What impact that has on P3s? I mean, I would assume we're going to be operating differently on the backside of this. And it's probably very, very difficult to determine that. And maybe some attempt over time, we try to figure out what it look like in the future. Just a comment.
Mr. Malvin, I just appreciate that so much because we really are trying to anticipate what that future could be. It's not going to be the same. And there are many opportunities in this, going through this process for us to actually do this better. So it's not going to be the same, and what the world will look like, I'm not sure anyone knows. I will say that I hear Aubrey say sometimes, you know, with risk, you can measure risk, you can value risk, you can monetize risk, but this is uncertainty. And so we're just trying to be very deliberate and base our decisions on facts. And that is just how we are walking through this. So those of you on this board are going to help shape, I believe, what's that future, that new normal is going to look like. I think you're going to play a very important role in trying to navigate that. So we have much ahead of us, and so we'll look forward to working with all of you to try to find answers to that question. So thank you, Mr. Malvin.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to this. I'm not smart enough to figure them out, but transit's going to have challenges for how long? I'm not sure. I mean, it's going to impact us in a lot of different areas. Maybe some positive, maybe not.
Madam Secretary, it's Mary.
Hi, Ms. Hines.
Hi, I just wanted to share that at the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, they're in the process of updating their transaction, their big overarching document. We just approved a contract amendment on Thursday to get the consultants to start thinking about what the new normal might look like. So that body of work might be useful for this board. I think it's due in the fall, maybe next spring. But anyway, they've got people working and thinking on it for the Northern Virginia region.
Which is great, and that's what we're all doing. I think when I mentioned in my earlier remarks that we're stress testing our systems, including budgets, and we're really trying to work with our partners, industry, trying to determine what that's going to be. I can honestly say I'm not sure if anybody knows exactly what it's going to look like. So, but we'll all be working together. So we're all in it together, which I guess is the good news. So with that, I'm going to adjourn the workshop. And we are now going to move into the action meeting. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Whitworth.
Madam Chairman, in light of the continuing state of emergency declared by Governor Northam, where it is impractical or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location, I move that we adopt this agenda to take action to discuss and transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue operation of the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Second.
And there's a monster right there.
Okay, thank you. Carol Mathis, I believe this is where we will have public comment.
I can inform there's no public comment at this time.
I'm sorry?
There's no public comment. No one called in.
Okay, so no one has signed up.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do I have a motion on the minutes?
Excuse me, Madam Secretary, we need to do a roll call on the vote made by Mr. Whitworth.
Oh, perfect. All right, will you call the roll?
I will.
Did someone say Mr. Rucker? If it's Mr. Rucker, aye.
No, no, I just had to acknowledge your laugh, which I love.
Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
that's an aye for Mr. Smoot. Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
that's an aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Johnson, come back. Ms. Hines,
Aye.
that's an aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Yates,
Aye.
an aye for Mr. Yates. Mr. Williams,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Whitworth. Ms. DeTunk,
Aye.
aye for Ms. DeTunk. Mr. Malvin,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Malvin. Mr. Kasprowitz,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Brown,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Miller,
Aye.
an aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Rucker, aye for Mr. Rucker. And Mr. Dodson.
Thought you heard me before. Aye.
Okay. Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
that's an aye for Mr. Johnson. The roll's complete.
Move acceptance
Just
of the
confirm.
minutes.
I will just confirm one more time, though, there is no one signed up for public comment.
That is what I am told. Nobody has signed up for public comment. There's nobody on the line.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry, did someone make a motion on the minutes?
Mr. Miller did.
Aye. Mr. Johnson, seconds.
A point of clarification, is that for both sets of minutes?
Both March 17th and April 21.
Thank you.
Second to both.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say, oh, all those in favor, we're gonna have a roll call.
I'll call the roll. Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Rucker. Mr. Miller,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Brown,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Kasprowitz,
Again, Scott.
Aye.
that's an aye for Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Malvin,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Malvin. Ms. DeTunk,
Aye.
aye for Ms. DeTunk. Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Williams,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Yates,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Yates. Ms. Hines,
Aye.
aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Dodson,
Yes.
aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
aye for Mr. Smoot. The roll's complete.
Thank you, Carol. What I'm going to ask Mr. Hofrichter is to go through all of his three items under land use. If anyone wants to pull one out, we certainly can, but I'm going to have them go through and we'll vote on them all at one time unless there's an objection to that. Okay, Mr. Hofrichter?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, Secretary Valentine, members of the board. I have 3 highway change actions before you today. First one is an old discontinued portion of Route 522 in Louisa County. Back in 1970, when the road was improved, this part was a little spur off the road. It's a loop that comes back in, and it was discontinued at that time. The northern end of that loop, the property owner would like us to get rid of the road completely and stop it from being a road. It was advertised. There were no requests for comments, and the county is in support of the action. It's just under 1/10 of a mile of road. It's 9/100ths of a road, and that's about it for that one. The next one is a discontinuance of Route 731 in Buchanan County. This is all of Route 731 that is in the state system. This road continues on as a county road past this point. There are 2 houses back there that are served. Neither are particularly interested in having state maintenance forces in the area, and county is in support of a discontinuance. Keeping in mind that a discontinuance keeps the road as a road. It just stops VDOT authority over it. The last one is a frontage road 881 in Fauquier County. This used to be a portion of old Route 55, but when Route 55 was relocated to cross Interstate 66, this portion was transferred to the frontage road system. The property owner, there is only one property owner that is served by it, and he has asked it to be taken out of the system and to be taken out of to stop being a road. And residents who reviewed it, counties in support, posted for comments, and no comments were received. So we agree that it can be taken out of the system and request that you approve this action.
I make
Madam
a motion.
Secretary, I'll make the motion to approve.
I'll second.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you help me understand what it means when we take a road out of when we discontinue a road out of the system, but it still remains a road? What does that mean in terms of who owns it, what the upkeep is, et cetera, et cetera?
Secretary Valentine, members of the board, the difference between those actions varies depending upon what system we're talking about. For a secondary system roadway, a discontinuance means that VDOT stops its maintenance and the road reverts to county control. For a primary road discontinuance, none of which are in front of you today, that means that VDOT will stop maintaining the roadway, but because it is a primary road, it is still under the CTB's control. We're just not spending any money on it. But the roads are still available for public use in both cases.
Where abandonment, they're not available anymore.
Correct. And abandonment means it ceases legally being a road.
Whoever owns the underlying land owns the road.
Correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Hofrichter, thank you for that. Mr. Tunk, is there anything that you want to add to the discussion on this?
No, other than I just support the resolutions as presented.
Okay, Mr. Stinson?
Nothing, Madam Chairman, except I do support as read.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor? I'll turn it over to you, Carol. I just want to apologize. I know I keep getting a few notes that I'm causing a lot of feedback, but I'm trying to mute as quickly as I can after speaking. So, all right, Carol, it's you.
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Smoot. Mr. Dotson.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Dotson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson. Ms. Hines.
Aye.
Aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Yates.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Yates. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Tunk.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Tunk. Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Kasprowitz.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Rucker. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Johnson. The roll's
Correct.
complete.
Ms. King. We'll go through both and then we'll take one vote. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary and members of the board. I have two action items for you today. Both are related to limited access control changes. The first one is the modification for the I-95 northbound river crossing in Fredericksburg District that Ms. Marcie Parker presented to you this morning. VDOT posted a notice of willingness for comment for the limited access control change, and the willingness window has expired with no comments. Representatives from the City of Fredericksburg and Stafford County have sent letters endorsing this project. Federal Highway has also approved the modification by the letter dated February 18, 2020, and the total estimated cost of the project is $132 million. I'm requesting approval of the limited access modification for this project by the board. The second item I have is another limited access control change for Interstate 395 at Washington Boulevard and Columbia Pike in Arlington County in the Northern Virginia District. This access is needed for the Eastern Federal Lands Highway Division Defense Access Road project. The reconfiguration of the interchange is due primarily to the Arlington National Cemetery Southern expansion, which is intended to maximize their internment area. Eastern Federal Lands held a public hearing for the project in February of 2020, and the County of Arlington and the Department of Army have both sent letters of support for this project. Federal Highway also approved modifications to the limited access in a letter dated April 23, 2020. The total cost for this project for Eastern Federal Lands is $59.8 million, and I am requesting the approval of the limited access modification for this project by the board.
I move that we accept this motion, both motions.
Second.
Second. Any further discussion? Mr. Rucker, Ms. Hines, anything you'd like to add?
I think in terms of Marcie's earlier presentation, it's really clearly understood how important this is to the region and the overall fluidity of the 95 enterprise.
And I would say on behalf of the other project, this is the second of a number of actions that we're going to be required to take to get this all sorted out. It's a real improvement for Arlington County and for the cemetery.
Carol, I turn it over to you.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Rucker. Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Kasprowitz.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Tunk.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Tunk. Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Yates.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Yates. Ms. Hines.
Aye.
Aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Smoot. The roll's complete.
Carol, Mr. Dudley. We'll go through all three. Mr. Dudley here.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary, members of the board. Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
Thank you very much. I have three items for your consideration today. The first is a revenue sharing deallocation of $13,074,249 for the Western Perimeter Road project in Montgomery County and our Salem district. You might recall this was deallocation was on our original revenue sharing deallocation list for January. However, the county requested that we defer the deallocation so they could work with other stakeholders to consider their options for continuing the project. After further consideration, the county has decided to cancel the project, which will allow these allocations to be placed on a revenue sharing balance entry account for redistribution during the current project allocation cycle. The Localization Assistance Division, of course, recommends approval of the deallocation of these funds. Our second item is a yes. Do I have a question? Okay, thanks. Our second item is a recreational access allocation request for Westmoreland County and the Westmoreland State Park in the amount of $230,000 to reconstruct a portion of Route 347, which provides access to a significant portion of the park's public facilities. As you know, Westmoreland Park is one of the Virginia's 6 original state parks and attracts over 250,000 visitors annually to the public recreation areas. If you are familiar with the park, you know that a prominent feature of the park is the Horsehead Cliffs, which overlook the Potomac River. These cliffs, however, have been eroding in large pieces over the years and are now within 30 feet of the current road and threatens to undermine the road. The Fredericksburg District Maintenance Engineer has determined that the road is inadequate due to the imminent road failure. The allocation would support realignment and reconstruction of approximately 1/10 of a mile of the access road so that the road can be relocated farther away from the eroding cliffs. Our Fredericksburg District has provided the estimate of $200,000 and will administer the project. If you reviewed a previous resolution of this previous resolution, it did request $250,000. We modified the resolution to request the amount needed of $230,000. The Local Assistance Division recommends approval of this allocation of recreational access funds. Item 3 is a request for economic development access funding for the city of Suffolk to assist in the construction of an access road within the Virginia Port Logistics Park for Massimo Zanetti Beverage USA Company, construction of a 350,000 square foot distribution facility. The facility is expected to result in an investment of $17 million and to expand its current operations in Portsmouth. The proposed access project will provide a 40-foot wide, approximately quarter-mile long curb and gutter asphalt roadway from Route 28 to the 25-acre parcel and is estimated to cost $916,000 to construct. The city of Suffolk will administer design and construction of the project and plans to begin construction in July. The Virginia Economic Development Policy Partnership has provided support for the plans to develop the property and has determined that Massimo Zanetti is a qualifying industry for use of the access funds. This resolution is a little unusual in that we would normally expect a resolution from City Council requesting the funds before bringing to the board, but due to the recent social distancing restrictions, they have not been able to provide such resolution. So we have included a contingency in our resolution that no allocations will be released until we receive the required city resolution. The city does have this on their council agenda for this afternoon at 3 p.m. So we should have that resolution this afternoon. Local Assistance Division recommends approval of $650,000 in Economic Development Access Program allocations for the request. Suffolk will be responsible for funding the required program match and for fully funding the project's cost estimate. With that, we recommend approval.
Thank you, Mr. Dudley.
I move that we advance these motions for approval by the board.
I second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Dr. Smoot?
Opposed? I'm turning it over to Carol.
Mr. Smoot?
Aye.
It's an aye for Mr. Smoot. Mr. Dotson?
Aye.
For Mr. Dotson. Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Johnson. Ms. Hines?
Aye.
Aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Yates?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Yates. Mr. Williams?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Whitworth?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Tunk?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Tunk. Mr. Malbin?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Kasperwitz?
Aye.
I for Mr. Kasperwitz. Mr. Brown?
Aye.
I for Mr. Brown. Mr. Stinson?
Aye.
I for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Miller?
Aye.
I for Mr. Miller. Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
I for Mr. Rucker. The roll's complete.
Thank you, Carol. Ms. Pryor.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary, members of the board. I have 3 items for your consideration today. The first item is the amendment of 5 projects to the 6-year improvement program. One project is the construction of a noise barrier on I-264 in Portsmouth. 2 of the projects are funded with I-81 corridor funds from the funds originally set aside for arterial route improvements. There's also a project funded with ITTF funding along I-81 dealing with operational improvements. And finally, a project funded by local funds for VDOT oversight and of design and construction for a project conducted by the Eastern Federal Lands Division of the Federal Highway Administration. And I recommend your approval of a project conducted by the Eastern Federal Lands Division of the Federal Highway Administration. I recommend your approval. The second item is just my normal monthly transfers, except that of course it covers 2 months this time, so the list is a little bit longer. And those are recommended for your approval as well. And then finally, the third is action on a SMARTSCALE project cancellation that I briefed the board on back in February. This is a signal project that was approved in round 1 in Goochland County. And subsequent to that project selection, it was determined that the signal was not warranted. And so the project is recommended for cancellation, and the $766,000 currently allocated to the project will be returned to the Richmond District balance entry. And I
Madam
recommend
Chairman,
your
I move approval as presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition? Ms. Mathis.
Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Rucker. Mr. Miller?
Aye.
It's an aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Stinson?
Aye.
It's an aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Kasperwitz?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Kasperwitz. Mr. Malbin?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Tunk?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Tunk. Mr. Whitworth?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Williams?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Yates?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Yates. Ms. Hines?
Aye.
Aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Dodson?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Smoot?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Smoot. The roll's complete.
Thank you, Carol. Harold Caples.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary, members of the board. I have 6 projects for your consideration today, 5 design bid build and 1 design build project. We're going to go through these on these PowerPoint slides for a little easier digestion. So we'll go ahead and get started. So Jen Renee, can you go ahead and go to the next slide? First project is order number B66. This is a Stanton District project in Frederick County for road widening. We had 2 bidders. The low bid did exceed the range of the evaluative estimate. However, after conducting our bid analysis, we find that the bid represents both market value and a good value to the Commonwealth and are recommending award.
I so move.
The next project is.
We probably should vote on these individually, and I hate to do that to you. So I'm going to take that motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition? Carol?
Renee, can you go back to the previous slide just so they're looking at what they're voting on? That's great. Thank you.
Mr. Smoot?
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Smoot. Mr. Dodson?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Johnson. Ms. Hines?
Aye.
Aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Yates?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Yates. Mr. Williams?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Whitworth?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Whitworth. Ms. DeTunk?
Aye.
An aye for Ms. DeTunk. Mr. Malvin?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Malvin. Mr. Kasprowitz?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Mr. Brown? Aye, that's an aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Stinson?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Rucker. That roll's complete.
Mr. Caples?
All right, Jen Renee, can you go to the next slide now? Thank you. This next project is order number B76. This is a Lynchburg district project in the city of Lynchburg for a bridge replacement and approach replacement over Norfolk Southern Railroad. We had 5 bidders on this project. This bid, the low bid, did it slightly exceed the range of the evaluative estimate, but with 5 bidders, we feel that it represents both a good value and market value for the department and are recommending award.
Mr. Dodson?
Yes, ma'am. This project's like 2 bridges. There's east of Lynchburg, right in the city limits. There's been a lot of road improvements in that area on 460. And these 2 bridges, I think one's around 68 years, another like 70 some years of age. And I recommend approval after working with the district engineer.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition? Carol?
Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Rucker. Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Stinson?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Brown?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Kasprowitz?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Malvin?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Malvin. Ms. DeTunk?
Aye.
An aye for Ms. DeTunk. Mr. Whitworth?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Williams?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Yates?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Yates. Ms. Hines?
Aye.
An aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Dodson?
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Smoot? Mr. Smoot?
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Smoot. The roll's complete.
Thank you, Carol.
Jen
Mr.
Renee?
Caples?
Thank you. Next project is order number 147. This is a Bristol District plant mix contract in Wise and Dickinson counties. We had 2 bidders on this project. The low bid was within the range of both the design estimate as well as the evaluative estimate. And after conducting our analysis, we find that the bid represents both market value and a good value and recommend award to the low bidder.
Mr. Stinson?
Madam Chairman, I would recommend, make the motion to recommend this on.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition?
Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Rucker. Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Stinson?
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Brown?
Aye.
I for Mr. Brown. Mr. Kasperwitz.
Aye.
I for Mr. Kasperwitz. Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
I for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Tunk.
Aye.
I for Mr. Tunk. Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
I for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
I for Mr. Williams. Mr. Yates.
Aye.
I for Mr. Yates. Ms. Hines.
Aye.
I for Ms.
Aye.
Hines. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
I for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
I for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
I for Mr. Smoot. The roll's complete.
Tables.
Jen Renee, next slide. Thank you. This next project is another order number 148. This is another Bristol District plant mix contract in Buchanan, Russell, and Tazewell counties. We had 2 bidders on this project. The bid was within the range of the evaluative estimate. And after conducting our analysis, we find that the bid represents both market value and a good value for the Commonwealth and recommend award.
Stinson.
Madam Chair, make the motion to forward this project.
Second.
All those in favor or opposition? Carol.
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
An I for Mr. Smoot. Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
I for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
I for Mr. Johnson. Ms. Hines.
Aye.
I for Ms. Hines. Mr. Yates.
Aye.
I for Mr. Yates. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
I for Mr. Williams. Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
I for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Tunk.
Aye.
I for Mr. Tunk. Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
I for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Kasperwitz.
Aye.
I for Mr. Kasperwitz. Mr. Brown.
Aye.
I for Mr. Brown. Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
I for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Miller.
Aye.
I for Mr. Miller. Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
I for Mr. Rucker. The roll's complete.
Tables.
All right, thank you, Jen Renee. Next project is order number C34. This is a Richmond District pavement rehabilitation contract on Interstate 85 in Dinwiddie County. We had 3 bidders on this project. The bids came in within the design estimate as well as within the range of the evaluative estimate. With after conducting our analysis, we find that the bid represents both market value as well as a good value for the Commonwealth and recommend it for your award.
So moved, Madam Chairwoman.
Second. Second.
Mr. Caples? Oh, is it just me who can't hear?
I heard a first and.
I heard both fine.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Something happened with my audio. So it's, do we have a
So moved.
motion for Mr. Brown?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Sorry,
Brown,
turning it
Rucker.
over to you, Carol. All those in favor or opposition?
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
I for Mr. Rucker. Mr. Miller.
Aye.
I for Mr. Miller. Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
I for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Brown.
Aye.
I for Mr. Brown. Mr. Kasperwitz.
Aye.
I for Mr. Kasperwitz. Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
I for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Tunk.
Aye.
I for Mr. Tunk. Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
I for Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Williams.
Madam Chair, I would abstain because of a business relationship with the vendor.
That's an abstention for Mr. Williams. Mr. Yates.
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Yates. Ms. Hines.
Aye.
That's an aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Smoot, and the roll's complete.
Tables.
And the last project that we have before you for action today is a design build project. This was the one that Ms. Parker spoke to earlier this morning. This is the I-95 northbound Rappahannock River crossing project. We had 3 bidders on this project. The low bid came in under the design estimate and within the range of the evaluative estimate. After conducting our analysis, we find that the bid represents both market value and a good value and recommend for award.
Mr. Rucker.
I move that we accept this motion.
Second.
Those in favor or opposition? Carol?
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Smoot. Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Dodson. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Johnson. Ms. Hines.
Aye. Aye.
That's an aye for Ms. Hines. Mr. Yates.
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Yates. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
That's an aye for Mr. Williams. Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Whitworth. Ms. DeTunk. Aye. That's an aye for Ms. DeTunk. Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
Aye for Mr. Malbin. Mr. Kasperwitz.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Kasperwitz. Mr. Brown.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Brown. Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Stinson. Mr. Miller.
Aye.
An aye for Mr. Miller. Mr. Rucker.
Yay.
That's a yay for Mr. Rucker. The roll's complete.
Mr. Caples.
That was the last project. Thank you.
Oh, now I get the yay. Boy, that went so fast.
All about good leadership.
You know, no, thank you all so much. Before we close it out, I simply want to say thank you to everyone. We will get through this. I just want you to be safe and stay healthy. And just to follow up on a comment from Mr. Yates, if you ever get a chance to see Delegate Jay Jones or Senator Louise Lucas, please thank them. They carry the safety portion in the governor's omnibus bill, and they work so hard on the governor's behalf and on all of our behalfs to really get this through in trying to get these things passed. So I know they're over from the Hampton Roads region, but if you all, Mr. Miller, Mr. Malbin, Mr. Johnson, ever get a chance to see them, please thank them on our behalf. And I say that to all the board members. They've worked extremely hard. So anything else before we adjourn?
Madam Secretary, I'd just like to comment on Carol's extensive expert work on all our behalf for pulling all this together. So thank you.
I'd have said it better myself. No, thank you. Carol did a really great job, and all the team and the operators behind them. So it was really great. So now I see you again on my screen, all of you. So it's really nice to see you. And we'll see what happens next month. We stand adjourned. And I thank everybody for streaming and being with us. Thank you. Bye, Carol.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
Take care,
Bye, everybody.
Good afternoon, folks.
Bye, everybody.